Hey there, tonight we're uncovering life in a colonial American town at Christmas. The truth is, while pine boughs and candles might suggest coziness, the real warmth came from community gatherings filled with simple joys and hearty laughter. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. The sun's barely poking over the horizon, and already the air's buzzing with the clamor of a colonial American town shaking off its slumber. You, my friend, are smack dab in the middle of it. The morning's a symphony of clattering carts, bleeding livestock, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Forget about the ideal of a sleepy, quaint village. This place is alive. And like a good cup of colonial coffee, it's strong enough to jolt you awake. As you pull your feet out of bed and onto the cold wooden floor, let's discuss the economic realities that these colonial folks dealt with. They're not just living in some Norman Rockwell painting. They're hustling to make ends meet in a world where coins are scarce, and bartering is a way of life. Picture this. A pound of tea costs you 6 shillings, which is steep considering the average laborer earns about 2 shillings a day. That's right. Sipping a cup of tea is basically sipping away 3 days' worth of wages. And let's not even get started on sugar, the sweet luxury that costs the same as gold dust at about 5 shillings per pound. The local economy here is a complex dance of commerce and compromise. Coins. Rare. So, what's the solution? Bartering. Your neighbor's got a bushel of corn, and you've got a pig that needs a new home. A little wheeling and dealing later, you've got dinner sorted for the week. It's a system that requires a knack for negotiation, not unlike haggling over a used car today. Staple goods like corn, beans, and salt fill the market stalls, essential items for any colonial kitchen. But don't romanticize this scene too much. That bustling market also means crowded streets, noisy vendors, and the occasional pile of horse dung to dodge. Your morning continues as you pass by John the blacksmith. He's been up since the crack of dawn, shaping metal into tools, horseshoes, and anything else the town might need. The blacksmith is the medieval equivalent of today's IT guy. Everyone needs his skills, and when something breaks, he's your first call. His shop is a hub of activity, with the air thick with the smell of smoke and molten metal. And let me tell you, those biceps, that's what you get from swinging a hammer all day. Next door, you find the merchant's stall, a place of intrigue and commerce. Merchants were the colonial Amazon, bringing in goods from far-flung places like the West Indies and Europe. They're the ones who make sure you can get your hands on that fancy silk or the aforementioned painfully expensive tea. Merchants had to be savvy, balancing supply and demand while dealing with the unpredictable nature of maritime shipping. And they didn't just sell goods. They were the town's gossip mill, spreading news from other colonies and beyond. Now, let's not forget the myth of the simple colonial life. It's tempting to think everyone spent their days in blissful harmony, but the truth is, it was a grind. The average colonial family had to be resourceful just to survive. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and pretty much did everything themselves. This wasn't some minimalist lifestyle choice. It was a necessity. And while we're on the topic of myths, let's debunk the idea that everyone in the colony got along swimmingly. For every cooperative neighborly gesture, there was a dispute over land or livestock waiting to erupt. So, as you continue your stroll through this bustling town, remember that the colonial life wasn't just a postcard image. It was a hard-knock reality where every shilling counted, every trade mattered, and every member of the community, from the blacksmith to the merchant, played a vital role in keeping the wheels turning. And while the romantic view of a colonial Christmas might be filled with cozy fireplaces and simple joys, the real story involves a lot of hustle and grind. As the morning unfolds, you get a sense of the community dynamics. The farmers are the backbone, working the land to produce the crops that feed the town. They're out before dawn, and their work doesn't end when the sun sets. The merchants, meanwhile, are the connectors, the ones who bring the outside world to the town's doorstep. Then there are the artisans, like the blacksmiths and cobblers, who provide the goods that keep daily life running smoothly. The town's layout reflects its economic realities. The marketplace is the heart, with its cacophony of sounds and smells. It's not just a place to buy and sell. It's where news is exchanged, deals are made, and community bonds are forged. The tavern nearby serves as the communal living room, a place to unwind and catch up after a day of hard labor. And let's talk about the social hierarchy. The wealthy landowners sit at the top, wielding influence and power, while the laborers and indentured servants make up the lower rungs. It's a hierarchy that's as rigid as the wooden houses lining the streets, yet fluid enough to allow for the occasional rise or fall in status. As you navigate the bustling morning scene, it's clear that life here is a delicate balance. The town thrives on cooperation, yet competition is never far away. Every transaction, every relationship, is a piece of the larger economic puzzle. It's a world of interdependence, where no one is truly self-sufficient, and everyone has a role to play. So, as you take in the sights and sounds of this colonial morning, remember that beneath the quaint exterior is a complex tapestry of economic and social forces. It's a world that demands resourcefulness, resilience, and a fair amount of cunning. And while the romanticized image of colonial life endures, the reality is far more nuanced, and ultimately, far more fascinating. As you stroll past the marketplace's organized chaos, the local church looms ahead, an imposing structure that's part spiritual hub, part community center, and dare I say, the original social media platform. This isn't just a place where folks gather on a Sunday. It's the beating heart of colonial social life. Picture the church as the town's Facebook page, where everyone checks in, shares news, and sometimes engages in a good old-fashioned debate. Now, let's talk turkey about the church's influence. It's not just about pews and prayers. It plays a pivotal role in shaping the town's social and moral fabric. The church is where you get the scoop on who's doing what, who's been naughty, and who's likely to end up in the stocks for public humiliation. Yes, that was a thing. Miss a few Sundays, and suddenly your absence is the talk of the town. It's a bit like how you'd feel if you skipped a few too many social gatherings today. People notice, and boy, do they talk. But beyond the gossip, the church also acts as a community glue. It's where disputes get settled and community projects get organized. Think of it as a mix of Judge Judy and a town hall meeting. The church leaders, often doubling as moral arbiters, wield significant power. They're like the original influencers, setting the tone for what's considered acceptable behavior. Onward, we mosey to the town square, where politics and power collide in a most fascinating dance. The town meeting is the ultimate democratic stage, where every free man, sorry ladies, you're still waiting in the wings, gets a say in local decisions. It's a bit like a modern-day city council meeting, but with more tricorn hats and possibly fewer PowerPoint presentations. The selectmen, colonial power brokers extraordinaire, hold the reins here. Elected by their fellow townsmen, they're the ones making the big calls. Their roles include everything from allocating land to levying taxes, and even deciding the punishment for those who dare to disturb the peace. With power like that, they're the town's rock stars, or at least the closest thing to it. And just like rock stars, they have their groupies and their critics. Now, let's dismantle the myth of a harmonious colonial utopia where everyone sang Cumbaya. The reality, a simmering pot of class distinctions and economic disparities. The wealthy landowners, sitting pretty at the top of the social ladder, control vast tracts of land and have the political clout to match. They're the ones who can afford to sip that pricey tea and sprinkle sugar in their porridge without flinching at the cost. Then there are the common laborers, the unsung heroes who form the backbone of the town's economy. They're the ones sweating in the fields, tending to livestock, and performing the hard graft that keeps everything running smoothly. But while they toil, they're also grappling with the harsh realities of colonial life, poverty, limited opportunities, and a social ladder that's more like a greased pole. And let's not forget the indentured servants, a reminder that the American dream came with a steep price. These individuals, often from England, Ireland, or Germany, worked for years under contract to repay the cost of their passage to the New World. Imagine signing away 5 to 7 years of your life just for the chance to start fresh. That's not exactly the rags to riches tale we often hear. Class distinctions are as apparent as the town crier's bell, ringing in everyone's ears as a constant reminder of where they stand. Wealthier families enjoy certain luxuries. Think imported fabrics and silver spoons, while the average laborer might be lucky to afford a sturdy pair of boots. And if you're an indentured servant, well, let's just say you're not picking up any fancy imports anytime soon. As you soak in the scene, it's clear that this town's social and political landscape is a tapestry of contrasts. The church, the square, the marketplace, each plays a role in this colonial drama where unity is an ideal, not a reality. Even as the morning sun climbs higher, casting long shadows over cobblestone streets, the town pulses with the energy of a community striving to find balance amidst its differences. So, there you have it, a morning in the life of a colonial town, where every corner holds a story, and every face tells a tale. As we leave this time capsule momentarily, remember that beneath the quaint facade lies a complex world of ambition, struggle, and paradox. And while the myth of colonial unity might persist, the truth is far richer and more intricate than any romanticized image. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover as the day unfolds. As the morning stretches into midday, the town shifts gears from the hustle of daily life to the anticipation of Christmas festivities. Now, before you start envisioning twinkling lights and last-minute shopping sprees, let's pull the sleigh back a bit. Colonial Christmas isn't your modern, gift-wrapped extravaganza. Nope, it's more of a holy day than a holiday, and the preparations reflect that. Think less about Black Friday deals and more about sermons and simple feasts. First off, let's address the elephant, or perhaps the rather sparse evergreen, in the room: colonial Christmas decorations. Forget about decking the halls with boughs of holly, unless you mean a few strategic sprigs here and there. The Puritans, particularly in New England, had a strict less is more policy when it came to festivities. Evergreen boughs, maybe a berry or two, but definitely no baubles or tinsel. In fact, the Puritans were so against Christmas frivolity that in 1659, Massachusetts actually made celebrating the holiday illegal. Fines were slapped on anyone caught making merry. But not all colonies were under puritanical rule, so the Christmas spirit varied wildly depending on where you were. In the southern colonies, for instance, things were a bit more relaxed. Picture Virginia planters indulging in a bit of wassailing, a tradition where folks would go door-to-door singing and sipping spiced ale. Sure, it wasn't exactly jingle bells, but it was their way of bringing some cheer to the chilly December nights. Now, if you were to time travel to a colonial Christmas dinner, you'd find it a bit different from today's turkey and trimmings affair. For starters, the colonial menu was dictated by whatever was available and affordable. Your colonial hosts might serve you a hearty roast, venison if they were lucky hunters, or perhaps a goose if the farm was doing well. And let's not forget the ever-popular plum porridge, a savory sweet concoction that was more gruel than pudding. Not exactly the sugar plum delights we'd expect today, but hey, it filled the belly. Colonial Christmas carols, they existed, but they weren't exactly chart-toppers. Hymns were the go-to, with lyrics that would make you feel more pious than festive. The idea was to celebrate the birth of Christ, not to inspire a dance-off. In fact, dancing, along with other forms of merrymaking, was frowned upon in many places. The focus was on the sacred, leaving secular celebrations for those who dared to defy the norms. And let's talk about gifts, or what passed for gifts. In colonial times, the idea of splurging on presents was as foreign as a plastic Christmas tree. If you did receive a gift, it was likely something practical: a new pair of mittens, a book, or perhaps a small toy if you were a child. The idea was to give something meaningful, not flashy. The notion of extravagant gift-giving as a Christmas staple would take a few more centuries to catch on. Now, here's a fun fact. Santa Claus, as we know him, hadn't made his grand entrance yet. The jolly old man in the red suit wouldn't appear until the 19th century. In colonial times, you might hear whispers of St. Nicholas, but the focus was more on the religious aspect of the holiday than on any mythical gift-giver. So what does all this tell us about colonial values? Well, for one, it highlights a society where community and religion were at the forefront. The emphasis on attending church services and gathering with family and neighbors speaks to a world where spiritual reflection trumped material desires. It's a stark contrast to today's commercialized Christmas, where the holiday season often feels like a marathon of shopping, decorating, and party hopping. But let's not pretend colonial Christmas was some idyllic scene of pure devotion. The truth is, the celebration varied widely, and not everyone was on board with the puritanical approach. In the more diverse cultural regions, such as New York, which was influenced by Dutch traditions, Christmas was a time for feasting and even a bit of revelry. The Dutch brought with them the idea of Sinterklaas, sound familiar, and with it, a more festive approach to the holiday. And while we're breaking down myths, let's dispel the notion that every family had a cozy gathering around the fire. For many, especially those struggling to make ends meet, Christmas was just another day to survive. A day off from work was a luxury few could afford, especially in a world where daily labor was necessary to keep the household running. Let's also talk about the regional and cultural variations. In Pennsylvania, the German settlers celebrated with Christkindl, a precursor to our modern-day Kris Kringle. This tradition involved children leaving shoes out overnight, hoping they'd be filled with treats by a benevolent spirit. Meanwhile, in the southern colonies, the holiday could stretch into a week-long affair, with plenty of food, drink, and the occasional bout of mischief. Despite these differences, there's a common thread that runs through the colonial Christmas experience: the emphasis on community and reflection. It's a notion that might seem quaint today, but it's worth pondering as we navigate our own holiday chaos. Perhaps there's something to be said for simplicity, for focusing on the intangible gifts of togetherness and gratitude. So, as you imagine yourself strolling through a colonial town on Christmas Eve, remember that beneath the surface of this seemingly simple celebration lies a tapestry of cultural influences and social dynamics. It's a world where tradition and innovation collide, where the sacred and the secular coexist in a delicate dance. And as the day turns toward evening, with the promise of a new year on the horizon, this colonial Christmas offers a moment to reflect on what truly matters, even amidst the hustle and bustle of daily life. Stay tuned, because our journey through this colonial day isn't over yet. There's still more to uncover about how these early Americans lived, worked, and celebrated, weaving a complex story that resonates even today. As the afternoon rolls in, like a lazy river that suddenly picks up speed, the town awakens to a different kind of energy. The morning grind gives way to a more communal vibe, and you find yourself swept along with the crowd. It's time for townspeople to gather for some good old-fashioned colonial entertainment. Forget Netflix marathons. These folks are all about face-to-face fun, and maybe even a bit of mischief. Now, let's dive into the games that brought colonial communities together. You've got your classics like ninepins, the colonial ancestor of modern-day bowling, where players try to knock down pins with a ball. And then there's stoolball, which might sound like a questionable furniture choice, but is actually a precursor to cricket and baseball. It's a sport that involves defending a wicket made of sticks, and it's as much about strategy as it is about showing off agility. Picture the scene. Farmers and merchants alike taking a swing, all while keeping an eye on the skies for rain that could turn the field into a mud bath. Speaking of weather, let's not forget how seasons dictated much of colonial life. Winter's chill puts a damper on outdoor activities, pushing folks indoors where they huddle by the hearth. But come spring, the whole town seems to burst into life like a field of daisies. Spring means fairs and feasting, with tables groaning under the weight of pies, puddings, and roasted meats. It's a time for celebration after the long, dark months, as the return of warmth brings a collective sigh of relief. During these gatherings, social hierarchies are as visible as the lace on a wealthy widow's bonnet. The upper crust, landowners and merchants, often host these events, using them as a stage to display their status. Imagine a family with a sprawling estate throwing a garden party, complete with musicians and dancers, while laborers and indentured servants look on, eager for a taste of the revelry. It's a stark reminder that even in communal settings, the social ladder remains rigid. But community events aren't just about reinforcing social tiers. They're also a breeding ground for the exchange of ideas and news. Picture a bustling fair where traders hawk their wares as townsfolk discuss everything from the latest shipment of molasses from the Caribbean to the ever-present threat of British taxation. It's a cacophony of voices and accents, with the occasional heated debate thrown in for good measure. In a world without smartphones, word of mouth is king, and these gatherings serve as the original social networks. Now, let's talk about the myth of colonial egalitarianism. It's tempting to romanticize these gatherings as melting pots where all were equal, but in reality, it was more of a layered cake. Take the town meeting, for example, where free men could voice their opinions. Sounds democratic, right? Well, not quite, since women, indentured servants, and enslaved people were notably absent from these forums. The facade of equality crumbles when you dig deeper, revealing a society where power is concentrated in the hands of a few. Yet, amidst this hierarchy, there's a sense of camaraderie that can't be denied. After all, these are the people who share your struggles and joys, who toil alongside you through the year. The afternoon's communal activities are both a reprieve and a reminder of the interconnectedness of the town's residents. It's a delicate dance between unity and division, where social bonds are forged as easily as they're broken. With the sun beginning its descent, the mood shifts once more. The games wind down, and the focus turns to the evening's entertainments. For some, this means a trip to the tavern, the colonial equivalent of the local pub. Here, the air is thick with the smell of ale and the sound of fiddles, as patrons swap stories and laughter over tankards of the house brew. It's a place where class boundaries blur, if only for a few hours, as the shared joy of a good tune and a hearty drink takes precedence. And let's not forget the importance of storytelling in these gatherings. In a world without television or radio, the art of spinning a good yarn is as vital as the air you breathe. Storytellers captivate their audience with tales of adventure, romance, and the occasional ghost story, holding listeners spellbound as the evening shadows lengthen. It's a tradition that underscores the power of words to connect, entertain, and educate, a reminder that no matter how much the world changes, some things remain timeless. As the afternoon gives way to evening, the town settles into a more reflective mood. The day's work is done, and the promise of a new dawn looms just beyond the horizon. It's a time to ponder the complexities of colonial life, where the old and new coexist in a dance as intricate as any courtly ball. Despite the challenges and inequalities, there's a resilience in these communities, a determination to carve out a life amidst the chaos. So, what have we learned from this afternoon in a colonial American town? Well, for starters, that beneath the layers of tradition and social expectation lies a vibrant tapestry of human experience. It's a world that's both familiar and foreign, where community and individuality constantly vie for precedence. As we leave this slice of colonial life, the echoes of laughter and debate linger, reminding us that while the past may be another country, its stories resonate even today. Stay tuned, because the day isn't over yet, and there's still more to explore in this captivating chronicle of life in colonial America. As the evening descends upon our colonial town, you might expect the day's hustle to slow to a crawl. But hold onto your tricorn hats, because now it's time for the main event, the family gathering. The colonial home, with its flickering candles casting shadows on the wooden walls, becomes the stage for the evening's communal feast. This isn't your typical Norman Rockwell scene of domestic bliss. Instead, picture a bustling room filled with the scent of roasting meat and the sound of lively conversation, all underpinned by the clatter of wooden utensils on earthenware plates. Let's dive into the colonial pantry to see what's on the menu for this Christmas dinner. Forget about today's standard turkey and cranberry sauce. In the colonial kitchen, practicality rules over tradition. You're more likely to find a hearty roast of venison or goose, seasoned with whatever herbs the family garden could muster. The centerpiece might be a dish of boiled pudding, which, contrary to its sweet-sounding name, is more savory than sugary. A concoction of suet, breadcrumbs, and dried fruit, all boiled to perfection in a cloth bag. If you're lucky, there might even be a pie, because let's face it, pie is the universal language of celebration. Now, don't let the simplicity fool you. This menu was as much about survival as celebration, with preservation techniques as rudimentary as a wooden icebox or a root cellar. Colonial cooks had to be resourceful, making do with salted meats and dried beans when fresh ingredients were out of season. It's a far cry from today's overflowing supermarket aisles, where abundance is taken for granted. Back then, even the smallest of indulgences, like a sprinkle of sugar or a dash of imported spices, was cherished and savored. As the family gathers around the table, the real magic of the evening unfolds, not in the food, but in the stories shared. Storytelling is the lifeblood of this gathering, a tradition as old as time itself. In a world without Netflix or TikTok, oral traditions were the original cinematic experience. Tales of heroic ancestors, epic journeys, and moral parables are swapped across the table, each story a thread in the fabric of cultural identity. The tales are as varied as the people telling them, ranging from heartwarming to downright chilling, with a ghost story or two thrown in to keep the children wide-eyed. This oral tradition is where myth and reality intertwine. It's where the legend of the hard-working pilgrim meets the harsh truth of colonial labor, and where the romanticized view of a close-knit community is tempered by the knowledge of social divides. These stories serve as both entertainment and education, imparting values and lessons in a way that dry sermons could never achieve. Yet, as we revel in these tales, it's crucial to interrogate what's changed and what remains familiar today. The nostalgic view of colonial life often glosses over the struggles and inequalities. Sure, the image of a family gathered around a table evokes warmth and unity, but let's not forget the laborers and servants who made these feasts possible yet were often excluded from them. The same goes for the indigenous peoples and enslaved individuals whose contributions to colonial society were conveniently overlooked in the narratives of the time. Fast forward to today's holiday gatherings, and you'll find that while the setting may have changed, the essence remains strikingly similar. We still gather with loved ones, sharing meals and stories, though our tables might be laden with more exotic fare and our tales told through different mediums. We still strive for connection, a sense of belonging amidst the chaos of modern life. And just like our colonial counterparts, we find comfort in tradition, even as we grapple with the complexities of our world. So, what does this evening in a colonial town teach us about legacy and significance? Well, it's a reminder that history is both a mirror and a lens. It reflects the timeless aspects of human nature, our desire for community, our need for storytelling, and it offers a lens through which we can examine the progress we've made and the challenges we continue to face. The myth of a simpler time may hold romantic appeal, but the reality is far more nuanced and, dare I say, richer for its complexities. As you tuck away this slice of colonial life into the folds of your memory, remember that history is not a static tableau, but a tapestry, woven with the threads of countless lives and stories. It's a narrative that continues to evolve, shaped by those who dare to question and those who strive to understand. And as the candlelight flickers low and the night deepens, we're left with a sense of continuity, a link between past and present, tradition and innovation. So, as you drift into sleep, let the echoes of colonial America play softly in your mind, a reminder that while the past may be another country, its stories are as alive and relevant as ever. And in the quiet moments of reflection, perhaps you'll find a bit of yourself in those tales, a connection that transcends time and place, reminding us all of the shared human experience that binds us together across centuries and continents. It's just another Tuesday in Manhattan, and you're a firefighter in one of the busiest cities on the planet. You've got your coffee in hand, half listening to the usual chatter at the firehouse, something about the Yankees and last night's game. That's when the day decides to slap you awake. At 8:46 a.m., the world gets its wake-up call, and it's not with the gentle hum of an alarm clock, but the violent crash of American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Yeah, you heard that right, the North Tower. The one standing proud at 368 feet tall, home to thousands of workers who just sat down to their morning emails. Suddenly, your radio is going off like it's possessed. Explosion at the World Trade Center is what you catch between the static and the chaos. You grab your gear and you're off, heart pounding, mind racing. You've trained for emergencies, sure, but this wasn't in the manual. This is the real deal, and it smells like jet fuel and burning steel. Now, let's hit pause on the chaos for just a sec. The World Trade Center, or the Twin Towers as they're affectionately known, isn't just any duo of skyscrapers. They're architectural marvels, each one boasting more than 110 floors. Designed by Minoru Yamasaki and completed in the early 70s, these towers were meant to symbolize peace through world trade. Irony, you see, has a twisted sense of humor. The towers had a unique tube-frame construction, basically a steel grid that was supposed to keep them standing tall, no matter what. Well, that no matter what wasn't exactly built to handle a Boeing 767 flying at 466 miles per hour, carrying around 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. Back to you, heading into the belly of the beast. You're in the truck, sirens wailing, and there's a palpable silence among your crew. It's the kind of silence that only comes before the storm, or in this case, amid it. As you approach the scene, the smoke is already clawing at the sky, turning a New York morning into something reminiscent of a disaster movie. People in the streets are pointing, screaming, or just standing there, mouths agape, trying to process the insanity unfolding above their heads. And then, just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 makes sure of that by slamming into the South Tower, driving home the point that this is no accident. It's a coordinated attack, a full-blown assault on American soil, and you're smack in the middle of it. The initial chaos is overwhelming. People are pouring out of the buildings, some covered in soot, others in shock. You're trying to direct traffic, calm panicked civilians, all while preparing to head into those burning towers. It's like juggling chainsaws, blindfolded. You can feel the heat from the flames even from blocks away, a cruel reminder that you're up against an unforgiving adversary. In these first moments, disbelief is your constant companion. How could this happen? Here, in the heart of New York City. You're used to seeing crazy things in this town, but this is on a whole new level. You've got your orders, though, and in you go. Up the stairs, past the floors where the air is thick with smoke and fear. It's an obstacle course of debris and panic, a gauntlet that makes you wish you'd skipped breakfast. And here's the kicker. The emergency response plans for the towers, they weren't exactly foolproof. Oh, they looked good on paper, sure. But in practice, let's just say they didn't account for planes being used as missiles. The evacuation procedures, the fire drills, they all fall apart under the weight of what's happening. You find yourself relying not on training, but instinct, yours and everyone else's. Inside, it's a different world. People are trying to make their way down, but some floors are already impassable. You hear cries for help, see faces full of terror, and you do what you can. You guide, you carry, you reassure. You're a lifeline in a sea of chaos, and you hope it's enough. As a firefighter, you're no stranger to danger, but this is unprecedented. You're not just battling flames. You're confronting a moment that will forever change the course of history. You know it, you feel it in your bones, even as you race against time to save as many lives as possible. And all the while, the clock is ticking. Each second is a reminder that the world outside is watching, waiting, and hoping you'll make it out alive. But hope, as you've come to learn, is a tricky thing. It's fragile, just like those towers seemed unbreakable, until they weren't. So here you are, one of the first responders in the thick of it all, trying to make sense of a senseless act. You're doing your job and then some, because that's what you do. That's what you've always done. And even in the darkest of times, you find a way to push through, because that's what heroes do. Yeah, I said it. Heroes. You might not feel like one, but try telling that to the people you're pulling out of the inferno. But hold on, before you start believing that every firefighter felt like Superman that day, let's pump the brakes on the hero worship, shall we? Sure, they were courageous, but invincible. Not quite. The reality was more Clark Kent than Superman, and that's no slight. The sheer scale of this disaster meant that even the best of the best were scrambling to keep up. Consider this. New York City's fire department, the FDNY, a hefty job on its hands. 214 units were dispatched. A mobilization so massive it's like sending every single player of every NFL team to a single game. And despite this, the logistical nightmare was about as pleasant as a root canal. First, the streets were gridlocked with panic-stricken civilians trying to escape, making it nearly impossible for emergency vehicles to navigate. You're a firefighter, trained to run into the chaos when others run out. But try doing that when you're stuck in Manhattan's worst traffic jam ever. And let's talk about the communication system, which was, to put it kindly, less reliable than a politician's promise. The FDNY radios were notorious for failing inside the towers. Dead zones galore. You think that in a city that never sleeps, the radios would at least stay awake, but nope. Messages got garbled or lost in the static, leaving firefighters to rely on hand signals and intuition. It was like playing a very high-stakes game of charades, minus the fun. All this chaos was happening against a backdrop of financial woes. The FDNY was already facing budget cuts before 9/11. Yeah, let that sink in. A city that's all about tall buildings and big business didn't exactly have a Scrooge McDuck vault for its fire department. In the late 90s, the department had faced fiscal constraints, forcing it to make do with aging equipment and understaffed stations. So, when the towers were hit, the firefighters weren't just going in with their courage and bravery. They were doing it with gear that might as well have been held together with duct tape and hope. Speaking of gear, let's not forget the bunker gear, those heavy suits that are supposed to protect firefighters from heat. They're basically wearable saunas. Now imagine navigating stairwells packed with fleeing workers while wearing one. You're sweating buckets trying to keep your cool, and all the while, there's the unspoken knowledge that your gear won't protect you from everything. It's like bringing a shield to a gunfight. And then there's the myth of the firefighter as the invincible hero. It's a comforting story, isn't it? That these brave souls can withstand anything thrown their way. But the truth, they're as human as the rest of us. They get scared, they get tired, and sometimes they don't come home. On 9/11, 343 firefighters lost their lives. That's nearly 3 times the number of players on a typical NFL roster. Each one was a person with a family, friends, and a life outside the firehouse. Their loss was felt deeply, and it shattered the illusion of invulnerability. Despite all this, the firefighters did what they always do. They pushed through. They climbed higher, even as the towers became infernos. They looked for survivors, guided the injured, and sometimes they just held someone's hand, offering what little comfort they could. It was humanity at its rawest, stripped of all pretense. Let's hit pause and zoom out for a sec. The economic landscape of New York at the time was a mixed bag. The city was a financial titan, home to Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange. But it was also a place of stark contrasts, wealth and poverty living side by side. Rents were sky high, and the cost of living was, well, less living and more surviving for many. The city's infrastructure was stretched thin, and the FDNY was not immune to these pressures. Politically, the city was a melting pot of opinions and agendas. Mayor Rudy Giuliani was in office, a figure as polarizing as pineapple on pizza. He had his fans and his critics, but on 9/11, he emerged as a symbol of resolve, even if his past policies were up for debate. The city was a microcosm of America, a place where the American dream was as much an aspiration as it was a myth. And then there were the towers themselves, the World Trade Center. They represented more than just architectural prowess. They were symbols of a city and a nation's ambition. The irony that these icons of trade and progress were brought down by an act of terror wasn't lost on anyone. It was a brutal reminder that even the greatest symbols of strength can be vulnerable. Back to ground zero, you're a firefighter amidst the chaos, trying to make sense of it all. As you navigate through the smoke and debris, you're not just fighting a fire. You're grappling with a moment that defies comprehension. You hear the rumble before you see it, the South Tower collapsing in a cloud of dust and debris. It's a sound that speaks of finality, a noise that marks the end of one era and the start of another. In those moments, as the world watches in horror, you're doing what you've been trained to do, save lives. But there's no manual for this, no guidebook that tells you how to deal with the enormity of what's unfolding. You're making it up as you go, driven by instinct and a determination that borders on stubbornness. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there's humor. Gallows humor, sure, but humor nonetheless. It's the kind of humor that keeps you going when everything else is falling apart. It's the quip about the radios that never work, the joke about the traffic, the wry observation about the absurdity of the situation. It's not about making light of tragedy. It's about finding a sliver of sanity in the madness. As the day wears on, the reality sets in. This isn't just another call, another fire to put out. It's a moment that will be etched into history, a day that will change everything. You're not just fighting flames and smoke. You're facing the harsh reality that your world, will never be the same again. And so, you push forward, one step at a time, one floor at a time. The weight of the day is immense, but you carry it because that's what you do. You're a firefighter, a first responder, and in the face of unimaginable odds, you do what needs to be done. You might not feel like a hero, but in the eyes of those you save, you're something even better, you're hope. Now, as the clock ticks on and the day turns into night, you're left with the knowledge that this is far from over. The challenges ahead are daunting, and the road to recovery will be long. But for now, amidst the rubble and ruin, you've done what you could. You've stood your ground, faced the fire, and offered a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times. And that, my friend, is something that no budget cut, no faulty radio can ever take away. But let's not kid ourselves. When the South Tower came crashing down at 9:59 a.m., it wasn't just another chapter in a disaster movie. It was a reality check of seismic proportions. You, standing there amidst the chaos, might have felt the ground shake and your heart drop. The South Tower, the second to be hit, but the first to fall, collapsed in a staggering 10 seconds. That's right, 10 seconds to turn one of the world's most iconic structures into a pile of smouldering rubble. Now, let's dive into the engineering nitty-gritty. The Twin Towers were supposed to be the architectural equivalent of a fortress, with a design that was revolutionary for its time. The core of each tower was a steel and concrete spine, surrounded by a lattice of steel columns. This was supposed to distribute the weight evenly and withstand, well, almost everything. But as it turns out, almost doesn't include a fully fueled 767. The planes, hitting at speeds of nearly 540 mph, were like missiles, breaching the tower's defenses with an unholy cocktail of jet fuel and kinetic energy. Here's where it gets even grimmer. The impact didn't just cause initial damage. It set off a chain reaction of catastrophic proportions. The jet fuel ignited fires that reached temperatures over 800 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, that's about 1,000 degrees hotter than your average house fire. At those temperatures, the steel beams, which begin to lose structural integrity at 100 degrees, stood no chance. It was a thermal nightmare that no amount of engineering foresight could have completely anticipated. The South Tower's swift collapse was not just a structural event. It was an emotional gut punch for the firefighters on scene. You're there, doing what you can to save lives, and suddenly, the very building you're trying to protect people from is coming down. It's the kind of moment that turns disbelief into a cold, hard reality. The sight of it falling, the deafening roar, the cloud of dust, it's like a scene from a nightmare, except you're wide awake and living it. Now, let's talk about the psychological toll. When the South Tower fell, it was more than just a physical collapse. It was a shattering of the invincibility myth. Firefighters, who are often seen as the indomitable backbone of emergency response, were faced with their own vulnerability. In those seconds, the idea that any problem could be solved with enough grit and determination was tested to its limits and found wanting. And it wasn't just the immediate impact. The collapse set off a wave of confusion and despair that rippled through the ranks. Communications, already spotty thanks to those unreliable radios, became nearly impassable as the dust cloud enveloped the area. It was like trying to coordinate a rescue mission in a fog of war, a fog that literally choked the airways and the airwaves. You've heard of gallows humor, right? Well, it was alive and kicking in those moments. Firefighters, known for their dark wit, might have cracked jokes about the radios being more useful as paperweights than communication devices. Beneath the humor was the grim understanding that their equipment was as outdated as a dial-up modem in the age of fiber optics. The FDNY communication issues weren't just a glitch. They were symptomatic of broader systemic problems, budget cuts, bureaucratic inertia, and a city that hadn't fully prepared for an attack of this magnitude. Let's not forget the human element here. Guys like Chief Joseph Pfeiffer, who was among the first chiefs to arrive at the scene, later described the day as a series of impossible decisions made in impossibly short time frames. In an oral history, he recalled the haunting image of people trapped above the impact zones, waving frantically for help that, tragically, couldn't reach them. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you long after the dust has settled. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the North Tower follows suit at 10:28 a.m. It's another 10-second horror show, a thunderous collapse that sends another wave of dust and debris cascading through the streets. For those on the ground, it's déjà vu of the worst kind, a relentless reminder that this nightmare is far from over. The North Tower, the first to be hit, but the last to fall, took with it the hopes that maybe, just maybe, one of these giants could withstand the assault. The impact of these collapses wasn't just physical. It was deeply psychological. It was a blow to the collective psyche of the firefighters, the city, the nation. It was a stark reminder that even the most formidable forces, whether they be steel structures or human resolve, can be brought down by unforeseen events. And let's not sugarcoat it. The equipment failures didn't help. In the aftermath, there were plenty of questions about why the radios didn't work, why the evacuation plans were inadequate, why the firefighters didn't have the protective gear they needed. It was a laundry list of failures that spoke to larger issues of preparedness and priority. The irony. The Twin Towers, symbols of economic might and technological prowess, were brought down by tools that were, in many ways, as outdated as a rotary phone in a smartphone world. In those moments, as the towers lay in ruin, the firefighters were left to grapple with the enormity of what had happened. There was no manual for this, no training that could prepare them for the sight of their comrades lost, their city scarred, their own sense of safety shattered. But in the midst of the chaos, there was also resilience, the kind that drives you to sift through rubble for survivors, to keep searching for signs of life amid the devastation. And here's a tidbit that might surprise you. Despite the chaos, the FDNY didn't just retreat. They regrouped, reorganized, and set up a new command post. It was a testament to their tenacity, their refusal to be cowed by the enormity of the challenge. The idea that you can keep going even when everything seems lost. That's the heart of what it means to be a first responder. It's the kind of grit that doesn't make headlines, but makes all the difference. So, where does this leave us? Standing at ground zero, both physically and metaphorically, trying to make sense of a senseless act. The collapses of the Twin Towers were not just events. They were cataclysms that redefined the boundaries of what we thought was possible. They exposed vulnerabilities, challenged assumptions, and forced a reckoning with the reality that even in a city that prides itself on resilience, there is no such thing as invulnerability. This isn't the end of the story, of course. The aftermath of 9/11 would stretch far beyond that fateful day, changing policies, reshaping priorities, and redefining what it means to be prepared. But in those first hours, as the dust settled and the enormity of the loss became clear, the firefighters on the ground were left to pick up the pieces, both literally and figuratively. They were left to find hope in the rubble, to find strength in vulnerability, and to remind us all that even in the darkest times, there is light to be found. And that, my friend, is where we pause for now. Because while the towers may have fallen, the story of 9/11 is far from over. There are more chapters to unfold, more truths to uncover, and more moments of humanity to explore. But for now, remember this. In the face of unimaginable odds, the firefighters didn't just stand their ground, they redefined it. So here we are, standing at ground zero, both physically and metaphorically, trying to make sense of a senseless act. The dust has barely settled, but the enormity of the task ahead is already staggering. More than one. 8 million tons of debris, that's right, tons, is what's left of the Twin Towers and the surrounding area. To put that in perspective, that's like stacking 1,000 Empire State Buildings worth of rubble in a city that prides itself on its skyline, not its landfills. But clear it we must, and it won't be done with a flick of a magic wand. Nope, this is going to take sweat, grit, and a whole lot of heavy machinery. Enter the cleanup crew, a motley assembly of firefighters, construction workers and volunteers, all armed with shovels, bulldozers, and a grim determination. It's the kind of Herculean task that would make Sisyphus think he got off easy. The operation at Ground Zero was dubbed the Pile, and for good reason. It was a heap of twisted steel and pulverized concrete that stretched the limits of what was humanly possible. The cleanup would take a grueling 260 days, marathon of endurance that would test the resolve of everyone involved. Now, let's talk about the real dirt, the kind that sticks to your lungs rather than your boots. The air around Ground Zero, post-collapse, was a toxic cocktail of asbestos, lead, and a smorgasbord of other hazardous materials. No amount of Vicks Vapo Rub was going to clear those sinuses. Thousands of first responders and volunteers breathed in this noxious mix for days, weeks, even months on end, often with little more than a paper mask for protection. It's like bringing a water pistol to a firefight, woefully inadequate. Fast forward a few years, and we start seeing the fallout. Respiratory illnesses, such as the ominously named World Trade Center cough, become commonplace among those who worked on the pile. We're talking chronic bronchitis, asthma, and an increased risk of lung cancer, all for the noble cause of clearing debris and searching for remains. It's an occupational hazard that nobody signed up for but got stuck with anyway. And then there's PTSD, the psychological shadow that loomed over so many of these brave souls. The trauma of that day didn't fade with the smoke. It lingered, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety, and a constant replay of the horrors they witnessed. It's the kind of thing that even the strongest cup of coffee can't shake off. You see, while the rest of the world moved on, the firefighters and first responders were left to wrestle with memories that refused to fade. But let's not skate past the bureaucratic quagmire that followed. You'd think a nation in mourning would rally to support its heroes, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The governmental response to these health crises was about as swift as a sloth on a lazy Sunday. Paperwork piled up faster than the debris itself, and getting compensation or medical help became its own kind of endurance test. The Victim Compensation Fund was established, sure, but accessing its resources was akin to navigating a labyrinth without a map. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that added insult to injury. And let's not forget the political song and dance. Post 9/11, there was this romanticized notion of national unity, a vision of Americans coming together, hand in hand, singing Kumbaya around a metaphorical campfire. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find a different story. The reality was a nation grappling with fear, suspicion, and deepening political rifts. The unity was real, but it was also fragile, like a peace treaty written on tissue paper. The Patriot Act, increased surveillance, and the lead-up to the Iraq War. These were all points of contention that revealed the cracks in that facade of togetherness. Economically, the impact was seismic. The immediate aftermath saw the stock market take a nosedive, with the Dow Jones plummeting over 300 points in the week following the attacks, a financial roller coaster nobody wanted a ticket for. The airline industry took a massive hit, too, losing billions as flights were grounded and travelers stayed home, wary of another potential attack. New York City itself faced a staggering $95 billion in economic damage, a blow that would take years to recover from. The city, like the nation, was reeling, trying to find its footing in a world that suddenly felt a lot less stable. Amidst all this turmoil, you had the survivors, the families of the victims, the firefighters, and the volunteers, all trying to piece together their lives in the wake of tragedy. They were the living testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can and does endure. But they were also a reminder that hope alone doesn't pay medical bills or navigate red tape. And what about the narrative of heroism? It's a comforting story, one that we cling to in times of crisis. But the reality is messy. Sure, there were acts of incredible bravery, but there were also moments of overwhelming fear and uncertainty. The firefighters and first responders were human, after all. They weren't impervious to doubt or despair. They were just ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary situation, doing the best they could with what they had. So, as we stand amidst the rubble, both literal and figurative, it's clear that the story of 9/11 is far from a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a complex tapestry of heroism and tragedy, resilience and vulnerability. It's a story that defies easy categorization, one that challenges us to look beyond the headlines and the sound bites to the realities beneath. And as we continue to sift through the remnants of that day, it's clear that the journey is far from over. There are more questions to be answered, more stories to be told, and more truths to uncover. But for now, remember this. The aftermath of 9/11 wasn't just about rebuilding structures. It was about rebuilding lives. And that, my friend, is a process that takes time, patience, and a whole lot of heart. And so, as the dust settles, we're left to ponder the seismic shifts 9/11 ushered in for firefighting and emergency response. The lessons learned from that day were as complex and layered as a New York cheesecake, sweet, dense, and occasionally hard to swallow. You see, the tragedy pushed emergency services to reassess their playbook, swapping out outdated chapters for a 21st century manual that could handle the unthinkable. Let's start with the gear. After 9/11, firefighting equipment got a much-needed upgrade. Out went the tired, worn-out gear that had seen better days, and in came the high-tech, flame-resistant suits that could make a firefighter feel like a cross between Iron Man and a Michelin tire. These new outfits weren't just about looking cool. They were designed to withstand higher temperatures and offer better protection, which is kind of a big deal when your job involves running into burning buildings. The radios, too, got a reboot. No more playing charades with hand signals. The new communication devices were supposed to cut through the static like a hot knife through butter. Although, let's be real, there's still the occasional glitch, because nothing says state-of-the-art like a dropped call during a crisis. Training saw a major overhaul as well. Firefighters started participating in joint exercises with other first responders, because if there's one thing 9/11 highlighted, It was the need for seamless coordination between agencies. These drills became as common as a Starbucks on a street corner, simulating disasters that ran the gamut from chemical spills to, you guessed it, terrorist attacks. The goal: make sure everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet when the next big thing hit, avoiding the chaos of 9/11, where half the responders were practically humming different tunes. But let's not slap a happy ending on this story just yet. While some strides were made, not all lessons hit home. Remember those shiny new radios? Turns out, even the best tech can't help if it's not used properly, or if the folks wielding it aren't fully up to speed. You'd think that after 9/11, emergency services would be glued to their radios, but old habits die hard. Miscommunication still rears its ugly head in crises, proving that technology is only as good as the people using it. And here's where we get into some murky waters. Despite the push for better preparedness, budget constraints and bureaucratic red tape often strangled progress. Fire departments, already surviving on shoestring budgets, sometimes had to choose between more personnel or better equipment. It's like deciding whether to buy a new car or pay for a year's worth of gas. Both are important, but you can't always afford both. The result: some departments still find themselves facing the modern world's threats with yesterday's resources. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the myth of the indomitable firefighter hero. Post 9/11, the image of the fearless firefighter charging into danger became an enduring symbol of hope and resilience. And sure, there's truth in that. But the reality is, firefighters are human with human limitations. They're not impervious to fear or doubt, and they certainly aren't immune to the emotional and physical toll of their work. The romanticized narrative can overshadow the real struggles they face: long hours, dangerous conditions, and the ever-present specter of PTSD. It's a myth that sells movies but doesn't pay the bills or ease the trauma. In the years since, security policies have been rewritten to reflect the new normal. Airport security became as tight as a drum, with restrictions that make packing for a trip feel like solving a Rubik's Cube. The Patriot Act ushered in an era of increased surveillance, with debates over privacy versus safety becoming as common as debates over whether pineapple belongs on pizza. And while these measures aim to prevent future attacks, they also sparked ongoing discussions about civil liberties, a reminder that every action has its reaction. But let's not forget the resilience part of this saga. Despite everything, the firefighting community continues to push forward, adapting to new challenges with the same grit and determination that defined their response on 9/11. They've learned to juggle the demands of modern emergencies with the resources they have, finding innovative ways to stretch budgets and improve safety. It's a testament to their commitment that, despite the obstacles, they remain ready to answer the call, no matter how daunting. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of 9/11 legacy, it's clear that while the myths endure, so do the truths. The story of that day is one of heroism and heartache, progress and pitfalls. It's a reminder that resilience isn't about being unbreakable. It's about rising from the ashes, scarred but stronger, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring. And in the end, that's the real legacy of 9/11, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who dare to run toward the fire when the rest of us run away. You ever wonder what it was like, really like, to live in a World War I trench? Well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a 5-star experience. Forget any romantic notions of noble warriors bravely defending their turf. Try instead to picture a soggy, rat-infested nightmare where the air was as thick with misery as it was with the stench of unwashed bodies. We're talking about a place where daily life was a relentless mud-wrestling match against nature and the enemy, both bent on your destruction. Now, let's chat about the trenches. Those infamous ditches stretched from the North Sea coast of Belgium all the way down to the Swiss border. The Western Front alone boasted over 400 miles of these winding, muddy fortresses. If you think your morning commute is bad, try navigating that on foot, knee-deep in sludge, with artillery shells exploding over your head like some twisted fireworks display. The trenches were not dug overnight. Engineers and soldiers carved these zigzagging lines into the earth, aiming to outmaneuver the enemy with intricate networks. But what they engineered in strategy, they failed miserably in sanitation. You see, the trenches were not just the front lines. They were home's sweet home for the soldiers. And home, in this case, was a cesspool of mud, lice, and despair. Speaking of mud, let's get into it, literally. Rain was a constant companion, turning trenches into muddy quagmires. Imagine trying to sleep in waterlogged clothes while your boots squelch every time you take a step. Soldiers often found themselves waist-deep in muck, an experience that was less heroic war story and more nightmare swamp survival. And when it wasn't the rain trying to drown them, it was the rats. Oh yes, the rats. These weren't your cute, animated rodents with jaunty hats. We're talking about rats the size of small cats, gorging themselves on the plentiful buffet of human misery, and occasionally human remains. And then there were the lice. Those little critters weren't just an annoyance, they were an occupational hazard. Lice thrived in the trenches, feasting on soldiers who were lucky if they got a chance to change clothes once a week. The constant itching and scratching became a part of the daily routine, a grim reminder that the war was as much against nature as it was against the enemy. Delousing stations were set up, but let's be honest, it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Soldiers even came up with a jaunty term for the lice: chats. Oh, the irony of naming a pest after something as genteel as a conversation. Now, if you think the trenches sound bad because of the mud and vermin, wait until you hear about the sanitation, or lack thereof. The latrines were basically just pits dug into the ground, and if you were lucky, there was a plank of wood to squat on. Hygiene was an afterthought, and the smell. Well, let's just say air fresheners weren't exactly standard issue. Disease was a constant threat. Trench foot, a ghastly condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp conditions, was so common that soldiers would often have to be carried back from the front lines because their feet were literally rotting inside their boots. The lack of proper sanitation didn't just affect physical health, it was a mental battle too. Morale was constantly under siege by the daily grind of life in the trenches. Imagine trying to muster enthusiasm for yet another day in the mud, with the ever-present threat of a sniper's bullet or a gas attack. In such grim conditions, soldiers clung to small comforts, letters from home, a hot meal, or even a dry pair of socks, as if their lives depended on them. And yet, despite the squalor, there's a reason why the myth of the glorious trench warfare persists. The stories of camaraderie and bravery, the legends of soldiers sticking together through thick and thin, have a certain appeal. But let's not kid ourselves. The reality was far less romantic. It was a brutal, filthy, soul-crushing experience where survival was a daily triumph. So, next time you hear tales of valor from the trenches, remember the mud, the rats, and the lice, because beneath the legend of gallant heroes lies the pungent truth of what it meant to be a soldier in World War I, an unwilling participant in a battle not just against the enemy, but against the world itself. Welcome to the trenches. Not quite the postcard from history you'd want to send home, is it? And speaking of the trenches, let's pivot to one of the less glamorous aspects of soldiering life, the fine dining experience that was the World War I diet. If you thought the mud and grime were bad, wait until you get a taste, figuratively, of course, of what the soldiers were actually eating, or more accurately, what they were trying to eat. You see, while the trenches were overflowing with mud and misery, they were distinctly lacking in fresh food. Fresh anything was about as rare as a unicorn siding. And to the infamous army rations, those culinary marvels that somehow managed to be both a lifeline and a punchline. During World War I, the average soldier was supposed to receive around 4,000 calories a day. Sounds decent, right? Just enough to fuel those heroic charges across no man's land. But here's the kicker. The reality was often a far cry from the nutritional utopia those numbers suggest. Rations primarily consisted of canned goods, dried foods, and hardtack, a type of cracker that was less snack and more edible building material. Canned beef, affectionately or perhaps desperately known as bully beef, was a staple. But this wasn't your gourmet, slow-cooked brisket. Imagine a gelatinous mass of mystery meat that, if left unchecked, could probably develop sentience. It was so salty that it might as well have been a practical joke. Add to this a heaping helping of Mackinac stew, a tinned meat and vegetable concoction that was more stew-like in theory than in practice. Its reputation, let's just say it made soldiers nostalgic for their moms' cooking, even if their moms couldn't boil water without burning it. And then there was the bread situation, or lack thereof. The soldiers often received what was called trench bread, made from a mix of flour and sawdust. Yes, you heard that right. Sawdust. The loaf was so dense and dry, it could double as a paperweight in a pinch. It's enough to make even the most die-hard bread enthusiast swear off carbs for life. The lack of fresh food meant that soldiers were missing out on essential nutrients, a fact that had all sorts of delightful consequences. Enter trench foot, the ghastly condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsanitary conditions. But poor diet played its part too. Without proper nutrition, soldiers' bodies were more susceptible to infections and ailments. In some cases, trench foot became so severe that amputation was the only option. Imagine losing a foot, not in a blaze of glory, but because your diet was as lackluster as the weather. Despite these grim conditions, soldiers found ways to inject a bit of creativity into their meals. Necessity being the mother of invention, they concocted culinary experiments that would make a modern-day food blogger weep. They mixed tea with condensed milk, creating a murky brew that was at least warm. When they could get their hands on potatoes or onions, it was like winning the lottery. Even the humble rat sometimes found its way onto the menu. Yes, you heard right. Trench rabbit, they called it, with a wink and a grimace. If you're grimacing too, you're not alone. The irony here is almost poetic. While soldiers waged war on the front lines, they were simultaneously engaged in a quieter battle of survival against their own rations. And yet, the myth of the hardy soldier, sustained by good old-fashioned grit and presumably better food, persists. The reality, as you can see, was far less palatable. But let's not forget the bigger picture. The lack of fresh provisions wasn't just a logistical oversight. It was a reflection of the broader economic strains of war. The sheer scale of World War I stretched supply lines to their limits and beyond. Transporting fresh produce to the front lines was a logistical nightmare, not to mention that much of Europe's farmland had become battlefields, leaving little room or time for agriculture. The war effort demanded sacrifices, and unfortunately for those on the front lines, one of the first casualties was the quality of their meals. So next time you hear about the glorious experience of trench warfare, remember the bully beef and trench foot. Remember that behind every tale of valor was a soldier trying to choke down a meal that might have been older than their boots. The romance of history often omits these gritty details, but it's in these unpalatable truths that we find the real stories of those who served. And just like that, the myth of the heroic, well-fed soldier crumbles, much like that infamous trench bread in a soldier's hands. As if the culinary misadventures of trench life weren't enough to contend with. Let's turn our gaze to the equally charming world of field hospitals during World War I. Picture this, a place where the Hippocratic Oath met its match in an ongoing battle against mud, blood, and a complete lack of supplies. These makeshift medical facilities weren't so much hospitals as they were a bizarre cross between a butcher's shop and an M***, a **S**H unit, minus the laugh track. The medical personnel were thrust into a chaotic whirlwind, trying to patch up soldiers with whatever they could find, which was often just a prayer and a pair of unsterilized scissors. Field hospitals were set up close to the front lines in tents, barns, or any structure that could house the wounded. And when I say close, I mean within earshot of artillery fire, because why not add a soundtrack to your surgical experience? These locations were chosen strategically, or perhaps masochistically, to ensure that the wounded received care quickly. But let's not kid ourselves. Care was a relative term. The conditions were so unsanitary that Florence Nightingale would have had a conniption fit. Medics and doctors, the unsung heroes in this grim narrative, faced a Sisyphean task. They contended with infections that spread faster than gossip in high school. In an age before antibiotics. Yes, you heard right. No penicillin here. Staving off infections was like playing whack-a-mole with a blindfold on. They did have antiseptics like carbolic acid, but using it was a bit like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. Trench fever, caused by lice, and the ever-dreaded gangrene were frequent visitors, unwelcome guests in an already overcrowded party of afflictions. The medical technologies of the time were, shall we say, primitive. Imagine trying to treat a shrapnel wound with instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum. Rust optional. X-ray machines were a luxury, not a standard, and amputations were often performed with the speed of a pit stop at a Formula One race. It was less about precision and more about survival, or at least trying to keep the patient alive long enough to send a letter home. And then there were the diseases. Oh, the diseases. Dysentery and influenza swept through camps with the enthusiasm of a Black Friday sale crowd. Dysentery, that lovely condition that turns your insides into a water park, was rampant due to contaminated water and poor sanitation. It's a glamorous way to go, said absolutely no one ever. The infamous Spanish flu also made its debut, killing more soldiers than combat did. Between 1918 and 1919, this pandemic claimed an estimated 50 million lives worldwide, about 675,000 of which were in the United States alone. It was a grim reminder that while bullets and bombs were terrifying, the real killers could be microscopic. The spread of these diseases was exacerbated by the cramped, filthy conditions of military life. Soldiers were packed like sardines in trenches and barracks, creating a breeding ground for every germ imaginable. It was a vicious cycle. Illness weakened the soldiers, making them more susceptible to the next pathogen that came along, which in turn spread like wildfire through the ranks. You could say the trenches were an incubator for more than just camaraderie. Now, let's talk numbers. Infections and diseases accounted for a staggering portion of the casualties in World War I. Estimates suggest that illness caused around 1/3 of all military deaths. That's right, more soldiers fell to disease than to enemy fire. Talk about friendly fire of the microbial variety. The Great War might have been a showcase of industrial might, but it was also a stark testament to the limits of medical knowledge at the time. The economic context, of course, played a role in this medical mayhem. The war effort drained resources faster than you can say, supply chain issues, leaving little for medical advancements. Governments funneled money into weapons and munitions, while medical teams were left to MacGyver their way through surgeries. It's a classic case of priorities being slightly askew, unless you believe that the best defense against an infection is a bigger cannon. Yet, despite the grim reality, there's an allure to the myth of the noble medic, tirelessly saving lives amid the chaos. And make no mistake, they did save lives. But the truth is, they were often just as overwhelmed and underprepared as the soldiers they treated. It's the kind of historical irony that makes you want to laugh and cry simultaneously. The legend of the gallant medic persists, but it's worth remembering the harsh conditions they operated under. Conditions that were more medieval than modern. As we look back on the medical practices of World War I, it's clear that they were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the enemy and one against the limits of contemporary medicine. And in many ways, they were losing both. So, next time you hear tales of battlefield heroics, remember the unsung struggle of the medics and nurses who fought tirelessly against the real, unseen enemies. Infection, disease, and the relentless march of time. They were the true underdogs in this story, battling not just for victory, but for humanity itself. And their struggle, like the war they served in, is a testament to both the best and worst of what it means to be human. Now, stepping from the muddy trenches and grimy field hospitals into the shadowy realm of the mind, we uncover yet another battlefield of World War I, the psychological toll of war, compounded by the rank squalor that soldiers lived in. While the Western Front was soaked in mud, the minds of the men who fought there were mired in something equally insidious, the burgeoning spectre of shell shock. Shell shock, the quaint term for what we now recognize as PTSD, was not simply a product of constant bombardment and the ceaseless threat of death. It was a cocktail mixed with a heavy hand of filth, fatigue, and frustration. Imagine living in a world where personal hygiene was a distant memory, replaced by the omnipresent grime of unwashed bodies and the relentless itch of lice. It's enough to test anyone's sanity, let alone those already teetering on the brink due to the horrors of war. Let's put ourselves in their boots for a moment, those same boots that were rotting from trench foot. Picture waking up each day in the oppressive dampness, with the cloying stench of decay serving as your alarm clock. The lack of sanitation wasn't just a physical assault, it was a psychological torment. It gnawed at the soldier's sense of self and humanity, stripping away dignity one layer of filth at a time. When you're constantly dirty, it's not just your skin that feels sullied, but your very soul. The psychological impact of this environment was as predictable as it was devastating. First-hand accounts from soldiers often speak of a mental fog, a sense of detachment from reality that was both a defense mechanism and a symptom of deeper trauma. In the words of Captain Charles Myers, a psychologist who documented these effects, soldiers exhibited a range of symptoms from tremors to hysteria. Imagine the daily grind of survival in such conditions, and then add to it the random cruelty of war. It's a mix that would make even the strongest minds buckle. One soldier, Private Arthur Hubbard, wrote in a letter home, "It's not just the bullets and shells. It's the mud, the rats, the lice. It's feeling like you're stuck in a nightmare with no end." His words capture the essence of trench life, a relentless assault not just on the body, but on the mind. The lack of cleanliness wasn't a mere inconvenience. It was an omnipresent reminder of the hell they were living through. The myth of the brave, unflinching soldier, stoic in the face of adversity, was a narrative that served its purpose, rallying support and morale. But let's be clear, it was just that, a myth. The reality was far messier, both literally and figuratively. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to keep going despite it, even when every fiber of your being was screaming to stop. In this context, courage took on a new meaning. It wasn't about charging heroically across no man's land, bayonet at the ready. For many, it was simply about enduring, picking yourself up day after day, despite the psychological toll exacted by the constant squalor and danger. And yet, despite the debilitating effects of shell shock, there was little understanding or sympathy from military brass at the time. Many soldiers were labeled as cowards, a particularly cruel irony considering the conditions they endured. Treatments were rudimentary at best, ranging from rest to electroshock therapy, hardly the stuff of compassionate care. The economic context of the war only added another layer of complexity. With resources stretched to breaking point, there was little room for addressing mental health issues. The focus was on maintaining numbers, on keeping soldiers in the fight. The notion of taking time to heal a soldier's mind was as foreign as the concept of a clean trench. The war effort demanded bodies, and the psychological well-being of those bodies was an afterthought if it was thought of at all. Despite these grim realities, the myth of the noble, mentally unbreakable soldier endured. It's an alluring tale, the idea that sheer willpower and bravery can conquer all. But as we've seen, the truth is more nuanced, steeped in a harsh reality that defies romanticization. The soldiers of World War I were heroes, undoubtedly, but their heroism was found in their humanity, in their endurance against unimaginable odds, not in some sanitized, glorified vision of warfare. As we continue to unravel the tangled threads of history, it's essential to remember both the myth and the reality. The stories of valor and bravery are important, yes, but so too are the stories of vulnerability and struggle. By acknowledging the full spectrum of their experiences, we honor their sacrifices more completely. And perhaps, in doing so, we can learn from the past, ensuring that future generations are better equipped to face the challenges of war, both seen and unseen. So, as we leave this chapter, let's carry forward the lessons of those who lived through the muck and madness. Their struggles were real, their battles not just against an external enemy, but against the decay within, the decay of body, mind, and sometimes spirit. In their story, we find not just the echoes of war, but the enduring resilience of the human soul. And as we look towards the next chapter, let's remember, the story of World War I is far from over. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to tell. Stay tuned. As we march forward, let's take a moment to consider the aftermath of all that dirt and decay. If you thought being in a trench was a special kind of nightmare, wait until you see how the post-war world had to clean up the mess, both literally and figuratively. End of World War I wasn't just a time to celebrate victory. It was a period of reckoning, where the unhygienic horrors of the trenches forced military leaders and governments to face some grim truths about the health impacts of war. First on the agenda, public health. You see, those trenches weren't just battlefields. They were breeding grounds for disease. The war may have ended in 1918, but the infamous Spanish flu was just warming up. This pandemic, which claimed more lives than the war itself, an estimated 50 million worldwide, was a stark reminder that the deadliest enemies are often the ones you can't see. The flu spread like wildfire through the ranks, exacerbated by the cramped, unsanitary conditions soldiers endured. This was a wake-up call that germ theory was more than just a theory. It was a grim reality. The post-war world had to take a long, hard look at its priorities. Nations realized that if they wanted to avoid future pandemics, they needed to invest in public health infrastructure. Cue the birth of modern sanitation standards and a newfound respect for the humble bar of soap. Cities began to overhaul their water and waste systems, recognizing that a clean environment wasn't just a luxury, but a necessity for national security. In the 1920 and 1930, countries like the United States and Great Britain poured resources into public health campaigns, promoting hygiene and vaccination programs. It was a revolution of sorts, sparked by the realization that a soldier's greatest weapon might just be a clean pair of hands. Meanwhile, military policies got a much-needed makeover. The architects of future conflicts took notes from the disaster that was trench life. The quagmire of World War I taught them that logistics weren't just about moving troops. They were about keeping them alive and well. The next time the world went to war, in 1939, armies were better prepared. Lessons learned from the Great War reshaped strategies to include better medical support and more efficient supply lines. WW2 saw the introduction of penicillin, that miracle drug that turned the tables on infection. It was a game changer, reducing deaths from infected wounds dramatically. Suddenly, the battlefield wasn't just a place of death, but one where life could be saved. But it wasn't just about medicine and logistics. The war's filthy legacy also sparked advancements in military training and planning. Future soldiers were taught not just how to fight, but how to survive. Training manuals emphasized the importance of sanitation and personal hygiene, transforming soldiers into not just warriors, but custodians of their own health. This shift was revolutionary, acknowledging that a healthy soldier was a more effective soldier. Beyond the battlefield, the war's grim realities shaped perceptions of conflict itself. Gone were the romantic notions of noble warfare, replaced by a more cynical view of the horrors of war. The squalor of the trenches punctured the myth of glory, leaving behind a deep-seated wariness of conflict that would influence international relations for decades. The League of Nations, founded in the war's wake, was an attempt, albeit a flawed one, to prevent such widespread destruction from occurring again. It was as if the world collectively said, never again, even as it stumbled into future wars. And let's not forget the cultural impact. The gruesome realities of World War I left an indelible mark on art and literature. The Lost Generation, writers like Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque, captured the disillusionment and despair of a world grappling with the aftermath of such devastating conflict. Their works painted vivid pictures of the psychological scars left by the war, ensuring that the grim truths of trench life would not be forgotten. Yet, even as the world moved on, the myths of the Great War persisted. The image of the brave, mud-caked soldier, enduring against all odds, remained a powerful narrative. It's a story we want to believe in, resilience in the face of adversity, courage under fire. But as we've seen, the reality was far more complex. The soldiers of World War I were heroes, yes, but their heroism lay in their humanity, in their ability to endure unimaginable conditions, not in the sanitized myths that emerged. So, what's the takeaway from this muddy saga? Well, it's a reminder that history is both romance and reality, legend and truth. The story of World War I is a cautionary tale, a testament to human endurance and a stark warning about the cost of conflict. As we look back, let's honor those who lived through the muck and madness by remembering the full scope of their experience, the heroism, the horror, and the humanity. Because in the end, it's not just about the battles we fought, but the lessons we learned in the mud and mire of history. And those lessons, my friends, are more precious than any victory. World of the Frankish kingdom in the 8th century was no place for the faint-hearted. This was a time when Europe was more of a patchwork quilt than a unified landmass, stitched together by blood, ambition, and the occasional betrayal. Enter Charlemagne, the man who would eventually earn the title Father of Europe, though his early days were more like a messy family reunion than a grand coronation. Born around 742, give or take a few fabrications, Charlemagne, or Charles, if you prefer a name that rolls off the tongue a bit easier, was thrust into a world where your best friend could be your worst enemy, and dinner tables were more about strategy than sustenance. In the Frankish kingdom, family dynamics were complex enough to make a modern soap opera look like a kindergarten play. Charlemagne had a brother, Charlemagne, who was more than just a sibling. He was a rival. The two were like oil and water, if oil and water had the ability to wage wars and shape the fate of a continent. Their father, Pepin the Short, had a knack for setting the stage for drama. Pepin, despite sounding like he might have been a short-order cook in another life, was actually the king of the Franks. He ruled from 751 until he decided to pull the medieval version of an Irish goodbye, abdicating in 768 and leaving his sons to sort out the mess. Now, abdicating was not exactly the norm. It was like quitting your job at the height of your career to become a professional juggler. It just wasn't done. But Pepin, perhaps fed up with the day-to-day grind of ruling, or maybe just eager to avoid the inevitable family squabbles, left the throne to be shared between Charlemagne and Carloman. Sharing a throne is about as easy as sharing a toothbrush, and these two brothers had the sibling rivalry to end all sibling rivalries. Charlemagne and Carloman were given two separate kingdoms to rule, a decision about as wise as giving two kids their own toy stores and expecting them not to start a price war. Charlemagne got the northern part of the kingdom, while Carloman took the south. For a couple of years, things resembled a tense but manageable co-parenting arrangement. But like any good drama, it wasn't long before things went south, literally and figuratively. Carloman and Charlemagne couldn't agree on much, which wasn't entirely surprising given their upbringing. They were raised in a world where power was an ever-shifting game of chess. Only the pieces were people, and the stakes were a throne. Their dynamic was a classic case of sibling rivalry, but with armies and territories instead of toys and attention. Carloman was the younger brother, and while some might say he had a chip on his shoulder, it was more like the weight of an entire kingdom. Things came to a head in 771, when Carloman died suddenly, possibly of natural causes, though in those days, natural causes often had a dagger or a dose of poison behind them. With Carloman out of the picture, Charlemagne seized the opportunity to take control of the entire Frankish kingdom. It was a bold move, not without its detractors, but Charlemagne wasn't exactly the type to let a little criticism stand in his way. This consolidation of power set the stage for Charlemagne's future exploits. It also marked the beginning of his journey towards becoming the legendary father of Europe, though at the time he was likely more focused on keeping his hold on power rather than crafting a legacy. He was a man as pragmatic as he was ambitious, with a keen sense for when to strike and when to hold back. Charlemagne's reign was about to begin in earnest, but for now, let's pause and appreciate the audacity and absurdity that shaped his early years. After all, it's not every day that a sibling rivalry becomes a stepping stone to an empire. With Carloman out of the picture and Charlemagne firmly in the driver's seat of the Frankish kingdom, it was time for some good, old-fashioned empire building. Think of it as medieval Monopoly, only with real battles and a lot less friendly competition. Charlemagne wasn't just content with consolidating his hold over the Franks. He had his eyes set on expanding his dominion. His ambition was as boundless as a medieval banquet, and his first targets were the Lombards and the Saxons, two groups that would learn the hard way that Charlemagne's version of diplomacy was often delivered at the end of a sword. First up, the Lombards. These folks were hanging out in northern Italy, minding their own business, or so they liked to claim. In reality, they were a thorn in Charlemagne's side, and he wasn't about to let them keep poking. In 773, Charlemagne marched his army over the Alps, which sounds picturesque, until you remember that this was before the age of heated ski lifts and GPS, talking about an army hauling itself over freezing peaks with nothing but determination and the promise of conquest to keep them warm. The logistics were nothing short of a medieval nightmare. Feeding and supplying thousands of soldiers in the frigid mountains was like trying to organize a rock festival in the Arctic. Still, Charlemagne had a knack for turning challenges into opportunities. By 774, he had the Lombards on the ropes, and their king, Desiderius, was sent packing to a monastery, because nothing says you lost quite like a lifetime of silent contemplation. With the Lombards subdued, Charlemagne added the title King of the Lombards to his growing list of accomplishments. But if you think he stopped to bask in the glory, you haven't been paying attention. Charlemagne was a man on a mission, and his next target was the Saxons. Ah, the Saxons. These guys were the wild card of medieval Europe, fierce, independent, and about as keen on Christianity as a cat is on taking baths. Charlemagne saw their conversion as a divine duty, but the Saxons saw it more as an unwelcome intrusion. What followed was a series of campaigns that spanned over 3 decades, filled with enough drama and setbacks to make a soap opera look tame. The Saxon wars were notoriously brutal, with Charlemagne applying a mix of military might and forced conversions to bring the Saxons in line. Saxons, however, were not the type to roll over and play nice. They rebelled so frequently that it was almost an annual event. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a recurring subscription you keep forgetting to cancel. The infamous massacre of Verdun in 782, where Charlemagne reportedly ordered the execution of 500 Saxons, is a prime example of how these wars were anything but chivalrous. Historians still debate the details, but the event remains a stark reminder that Charlemagne's legacy is as much about conquest as it is about culture. But why such an obsession with subduing the Saxons, you ask? Well, aside from the religious fervor, there was a hefty dose of economics involved. The Saxon lands were rich in resources, and controlling them meant more revenue for Charlemagne's burgeoning empire. It was as much about securing trade routes and filling coffers as it was about spreading the gospel. And let's not forget the prestige. In a world where power was often measured by the size of your realm, adding Saxon lands to his empire was the medieval equivalent of a billionaire buying a new yacht. Now, while Charlemagne was busy playing empire builder, his armies were learning the fine, and often deadly, art of medieval warfare. Forget the romantic image of knights in shining armor. This was a gritty business. Armies were made up of hastily assembled levies, mercenaries, and a few professional soldiers, all of whom needed to be fed, armed, and occasionally paid. The cost of warfare was astronomical, and Charlemagne had to rely on a mix of plunder, taxes, and good old-fashioned feudal obligations to keep his military machine running. It was a logistical nightmare, akin to trying to organize a family reunion with thousands of unruly relatives who all expect a feast at the end of the day. Despite the chaos and cost, Charlemagne's military campaigns laid the foundation for what would become the Carolingian Empire. His ability to adapt and innovate, using everything from new siege techniques to savvy diplomacy, was what set him apart. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a strategist, one who understood that an empire wasn't built on brute force alone. It needed a blend of strength, cunning, and a touch of ruthlessness, all of which Charlemagne had in spades. Of course, not everything went according to plan. The Saxon Wars, in particular, were a series of misadventures that often seemed more like a game of whack-a-mole than a coherent military strategy. Every time Charlemagne thought he had subdued the Saxons, they'd pop up again, more defiant than ever. But rather than see these setbacks as failures, Charlemagne treated them as opportunities to learn and adapt. It was this relentless pursuit of expansion, despite the odds and the occasional blunder, that cemented his reputation as the father of Europe. So, as we leave Charlemagne for now, poised on the brink of further conquests, and perhaps a bit weary from the Saxon debacle, remember that his story is far from over. We've only scratched the surface of his military exploits and the empire he sought to build. The legend and the reality of Charlemagne are still unfolding, and there's plenty more drama, intrigue, and medieval madness yet to come. Stay tuned, because the father of Europe is just getting started. Charlemagne may have been a warrior king with more campaigns under his belt than a modern-day general could ever dream of. But he wasn't all about swords and conquest. Beneath that battle-hardened exterior was a man who harbored a surprising passion for the arts and education, or at least the medieval version of them. Picture it, a ruler who could pivot from battlefield strategy to debating the merits of Latin grammar without missing a beat. This was a time when the average noble was more concerned with swinging a sword than deciphering the nuances of poetry. Yet here was Charlemagne, ready to transform his court into a beacon of learning in an era that often preferred the clang of armor to the scratching of quills. Charlemagne's court was like the ultimate medieval think tank, a hub for scholars, artists, and intellectuals who flocked to his side like moths to a very well-illuminated flame. He wasn't just surrounded by yes-men. His inner circle included some of the most learned minds of the time, like Alcuin of York. Alcuin, an English scholar with a penchant for theology and an eye for detail, became Charlemagne's educational guru. The king's court was less about courtly intrigue and more like the Hogwarts of the early Middle Ages, sans magic, but with a lot of monastic manuscripts. Now, let's talk about the Carolingian Renaissance. A bit of a misnomer, if we're being honest. Calling it a Renaissance might make it sound like everyone was suddenly painting like Michelangelo or composing symphonies worthy of Beethoven. In reality, this cultural rebirth was more about salvaging what remained of classical knowledge and ensuring it didn't disappear into the abyss of history. Charlemagne's empire was vast, and with vastness comes the need for administration. Literacy and education were not just luxuries, they were necessities for governance. It was like Charlemagne realized that while you could conquer a kingdom with a sword, you needed scribes to actually run it. The Carolingian script was born out of this necessity, a clear, legible script that was a godsend for those weary monks who spent their days copying texts by hand. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of switching from Comic Sans to Times New Roman. It made reading and writing more accessible, aiding in the spread of knowledge. It was practical, efficient, and a little bit revolutionary. By promoting this new script, Charlemagne was effectively laying the groundwork for a more literate society, one manuscript at a time. Charlemagne's educational reforms didn't stop at scribes and scripts. He established schools, not just for the elite, but for the sons of nobles and even gifted commoners. This was no small feat in a time when education was often a privilege reserved for the cloistered few. He decreed that every cathedral and monastery should open a school, ensuring that education wasn't just an afterthought, but a cornerstone of his empire. It was like he was trying to create an early version of public education, a radical notion when most rulers were more interested in taxing peasants than educating them. This push for learning was not without its contradictions. Here was a king who, between military campaigns, would sit down to discuss theology and philosophy with his scholars. The paradox of a warrior king championing literacy is a fascinating one, like a rock star advocating for classical music. But Charlemagne was nothing if not pragmatic. He understood that knowledge was power, and in a world where information was as valuable as gold, being the most informed ruler was a strategic advantage. Of course, this wasn't just about creating a learned society for the sake of enlightenment. There were political and economic benefits to Charlemagne's cultural renaissance. An educated clergy meant a more efficient administration of his empire, and promoting Latin as a lingua franca helped unify his diverse territories. It was like he was building an empire with more than just walls and soldiers. He was constructing a cultural and intellectual legacy that would outlast his military conquests. Despite the high-minded ideals, Charlemagne's court was not all scholarly debates and academic pursuits. It was a place where politics and power still reigned supreme. The emperor's charisma and vision attracted a variety of individuals, from ambitious nobles to ecclesiastical leaders, each with their own agendas. Navigating this complex web of relationships required more than just knowledge. It demanded political acumen and a dash of cunning. Charlemagne was nothing if not a master of both. The appeal of this cultural renaissance lay not only in its scholarly achievements, but also in the mythic image it cultivated. Charlemagne was cast as a patron of the arts, a wise ruler who valued knowledge as much as he did power, an image that endured long after his empire faded. The romantic ideal of the philosopher king has a certain allure, even if the reality was a bit more brutal. In the end, Charlemagne's legacy as a cultural innovator is as much a part of his story as his military exploits. He was a complex figure, a king who wielded both sword and pen, who built an empire on conquest, but sought to sustain it through culture and learning. As we continue our journey through his life, remember that his story, like any good epic, is filled with contradictions and complexities. The father of Europe was not just a conqueror. He was a visionary who dared to imagine a world where knowledge was as prized as power. Stay tuned, because Charlemagne's tale is far from over, and there's plenty more intrigue, intellect, and medieval madness to come. While Charlemagne was busy crafting his legacy as a cultural innovator, he was also entangled in a web of political intrigue that makes today's drama-filled boardrooms look like a kid's playdate. Enter the papacy, those formidable leaders of the church who wielded spiritual power like a double-edged sword. The relationship between Charlemagne and the popes was a complex one. more akin to a high-stakes poker game than a holy alliance. The year was 800, and Pope Leo Roman III was in a bit of a pickle. Picture this. He was facing accusations of adultery and perjury, a scandalous mix of charges that could make even the most hardened tabloid editor blush. Now, in those days, a pope in trouble was a bit like a fish out of water, flopping around, desperately seeking a solution. Enter Charlemagne, our medieval maestro, who saw an opportunity to change the game. Charlemagne's alliance with the papacy was not just some quaint spiritual bond. It was a calculated move in a geopolitical chess match. By supporting Leo, Charlemagne was positioning himself as the protector of the church, a role that came with perks as tantalizing as a VIP pass to the afterlife. But it wasn't just about saving Leo's skin. There was a bigger prize at play, the title of emperor. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, while everyone else was busy with their medieval festivities, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo Roman III. Cue the choir, the incense, and the political maneuvering. This coronation was a masterstroke of political theater, complete with the kind of pomp and circumstance that would make a Broadway director proud. But here's the kicker. Charlemagne claimed he had no idea the coronation was coming. It's like being surprised by a birthday party you planned yourself. The coronation wasn't just a ceremonial spectacle. It was a strategic power play. Charlemagne, now emperor, was no longer just a king of the Franks. He was the ruler of a revived Roman Empire, or so the story goes. But let's pause for a reality check. This wasn't the Roman Empire of Caesar and Augustus. It was more like a reboot with a medieval twist. Charlemagne's empire was vast, but it was also a patchwork of territories held together by loyalty, marriage alliances, and the occasional military campaign. The coronation marked the birth of what would become the Holy Roman Empire, a name as grandiose as it was misleading. Voltaire famously quipped that it was neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire, and he wasn't far off the mark. The empire was a loose confederation of territories, with Charlemagne trying to keep everyone on the same hymn sheet. It was an empire in name, but in practice, it was more like a collection of fiefdoms, each with its own quirks and challenges. Economically speaking, being crowned emperor wasn't just about wearing a shiny new title. It came with economic benefits that were as enticing as a medieval treasure trove. Charlemagne now had the papal endorsement to levy taxes, mint coins, and expand trade across his empire. It was like getting the keys to a kingdom, but with a divine seal of approval. And let's not forget the prestige. In a world where status was everything, being emperor was the ultimate power move. The romanticized narrative of Charlemagne's coronation often overlooks the gritty reality of medieval politics. The papacy, for all its spiritual authority, was also deeply enmeshed in the secular power struggles of the time. For Pope Leo Roman III, crowning Charlemagne was as much about securing his own position as it was about reviving the glory of Rome. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, a medieval quid pro quo that ensured both parties got what they wanted, at least for a time. Charlemagne's relationship with the papacy was not without its tensions. The popes were allies, but they were also political players with their own agendas. The papal states needed protection from their enemies, and Charlemagne needed the church's blessing to legitimize his rule. It was a delicate balancing act, like a game of medieval twister, with each side trying to maintain their footing while reaching for more power. As emperor, Charlemagne faced the daunting task of governing a sprawling empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. It was a logistical nightmare, akin to managing a multinational corporation with a medieval communications network, letters carried by horseback, and messages that took weeks to arrive. The challenges were immense, but Charlemagne had a knack for turning chaos into order, or at least a semblance of it. The creation of the Holy Roman Empire also had broader implications for Europe. It set the stage for centuries of political and religious conflict, as emperors and popes vied for supremacy in a power struggle that would shape the continent's history. It was the beginning of a complex relationship that would see alliances forged and broken, battles fought, and empires rise and fall. The stage was set for a medieval soap opera, with Charlemagne as one of its central characters. The myth of Charlemagne as the benevolent, divinely appointed ruler endures, but the reality was far more nuanced. He was a shrewd politician, a master of realpolitik, who understood that power was as much about perception as it was about control. His interactions with the papacy were a testament to his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval diplomacy, using both charm and force to achieve his ends. So, as we leave Charlemagne, newly crowned, and navigating the turbulent seas of empire, remember that his story is a tapestry of myth and reality, woven together with threads of ambition, strategy, and a fair bit of medieval machination. The father of Europe was not just a warrior or a patron of the arts. He was a political mastermind who reshaped the continent in ways that continue to reverberate through history. Stay tuned, because the saga of Charlemagne is far from over, and there's plenty more intrigue, power plays, and historical twists to come. As we sail into the final chapter of Charlemagne's saga, we find ourselves navigating the charpy waters of his legacy, an enduring influence that lingers like the scent of incense long after the candles have burned out. Charlemagne's reign, which lasted from 768 to 814, was not only a turning point in medieval history, but also a pivotal moment that shaped the trajectory of Europe. But before we crown him with too many laurels, let's take a closer look at the myths and realities of his rule. Spoiler alert, it's not all glory and grandiosity. First, let's tackle the myth of Charlemagne as the benevolent patriarch. Sure, he was dubbed the father of Europe, but fatherhood in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly synonymous with warmth and fuzzy feelings. Charlemagne's rule was more akin to a medieval boot camp, where discipline and authority were the order of the day. His famous capitulary for the Saxons, a series of laws issued in 785, was less about benevolence and more about ensuring compliance. It stipulated, among other things, the death penalty for those who refused baptism, not exactly the hallmark of a gentle ruler. Charlemagne's reforms, though, were undeniably transformative. He was a master of statecraft, weaving a tapestry of political, economic, and religious policies that would lay the groundwork for a more unified Europe. His introduction of standardized weights and measures was revolutionary for trade, providing a common framework that made it a bit harder for merchants to cheat each other. It was like introducing a medieval version of Yelp. Suddenly, everyone was on the same page. His economic reforms extended to currency too. Charlemagne established the silver denarius, a coin that became the cornerstone of his empire's economy. It wasn't just a shiny piece of metal. It was a symbol of stability and trust in a time when bartering was as common as bad weather. By insisting on uniformity, Charlemagne was effectively saying, "Hey, let's play by the same rules." And in a world of chaos, that was nothing short of revolutionary. But perhaps the most significant of Charlemagne's reforms was his emphasis on education and literacy. He recognized that an educated clergy was essential for governance, so he mandated the establishment of schools throughout his empire. It was a bold move, in an era where knowledge was as rare as a vegetarian at a medieval feast. By promoting learning, Charlemagne wasn't just preparing the next generation of leaders. He was planting the seeds for a cultural revival that would bloom centuries later. Despite these achievements, Charlemagne's legacy wasn't all roses. The succession plans he laid out were about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Charlemagne had 3 legitimate sons, Charles, Pepin, and Louis, and like any good medieval patriarch, he wanted to divide his empire among them. However, fate had other plans. Charles and Pepin died before their father, leaving Louis the Pious as the sole heir. It was a classic case of best-laid plans, and when Charlemagne passed away in 814, Louis was left to juggle the responsibilities of an empire that was both vast and unwieldy. Louis's reign was marked by internal strife and rebellion, as his sons, Laraia, Pepin, and Louis the German, squabbled over their inheritance like siblings fighting over the last slice of pizza. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 eventually divided the empire into 3 parts, setting the stage for the development of modern European states. It was the medieval equivalent of a messy divorce, where everyone got a piece of the pie, but no one was entirely satisfied. Charlemagne's legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry of triumph and turmoil. His policies laid the foundation for a more unified Europe, but his inability to secure a smooth succession left his empire vulnerable to fragmentation. It's a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are at the mercy of fate and family dynamics. As we wrap up our journey through Charlemagne's life, let's not forget the mythic image that has endured through the ages. The legends of Charlemagne as a wise and just ruler have echoed through history, inspiring countless tales of chivalry and valor. But beneath the romantic veneer lies a more nuanced reality, a ruler who was as pragmatic as he was ambitious, whose vision for Europe was both grand and flawed. Charlemagne's story is a testament to the complexities of power and legacy. He was a conqueror and a reformer, a ruler who wielded both sword and scripture to shape the destiny of a continent. His impact reverberates to this day, a reminder that the past is never truly past. So as you drift off to sleep, ponder this. The father of Europe was not just a larger-than-life figure, but a man who dared to dream big, even as the realities of his world conspired to bring him back down to earth. And in that, perhaps, lies the true essence of his legacy, a vision that transcends the ages, imperfect and enduring, much like history itself. The first rays of sunlight break over the horizon, rousing you from the hay-stuffed mattress in your Viking longhouse. Outside, the village of Korpeng is already stirring to life, a symphony of sounds as vibrant as a Norse saga. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, carrying the scent of breakfast, gruel, with a side of last night's fish. Not exactly a Michelin-starred affair, but it keeps you fueled for a day that promises adventure on the high seas. In the chill morning air, join your fellow villagers, a motley crew of farmers, hunters and craftsmen. Today, the focus isn't on tilling the land or mending nets. No, today is about the Longship, a wooden marvel that's as much a part of Viking life as mead and sagas of yore. A quick survey of the shipyard reveals the skeletal frame of a longship, its rib-like planks reaching skyward. It's here that the real magic happens, where craftsmanship and innovation collide in a cacophony of hammers and saws. Now, let's clear up a common misconception. These longships didn't just appear out of thin air like Thor's hammer. They were the product of meticulous planning, requiring roughly 20 to 30 men working on them for an entire year. That's right, a full year. We're not just talking about slapping together some timber and calling it a day. No, these ships were masterpieces of engineering, designed to cut through the water with the elegance of a swan and the speed of a falcon. Speaking of timber, you might wonder where all that wood came from. Well, the Scandinavian forests were generous with their gifts of oak and pine. Oak for the keel, because let's be honest, you don't want your ship snapping in half mid-raid, and pine for the planks, which were overlapped and riveted together in a technique called clinker building. It's like the Viking version of IKEA, functional, durable, and bound to involve a missing piece or two. But unlike IKEA, there wasn't a handy Allen wrench included. Each longship cost a small fortune, equivalent to around 1,000 cattle. That's not just a lot of milk and cheese. That's wealth beyond measure, enough to make even the most stoic Viking chieftain's eyes twinkle with ambition. But it was an investment in the future, a ticket to lands unknown and riches untold. So every morning, you and the villagers gather at the shipyard, chipping away at the dream of conquest and trade, one plank at a time. Craftsmanship in Viking shipbuilding wasn't just about brute strength, it was an art form. The shipbuilders, known as skippersmither, were revered as much as warriors. They had an eye for detail that would make a jeweler blush, ensuring each plank fits snugly against the next, each joint sealed against the relentless sea. This wasn't just about surviving the journey, it was about dominating it. After all, what's the point of reaching the shores of England if you arrive looking like a drowned rat? Innovation was the name of the game, and the Vikings were playing to win. Their ships weren't just fast, they were versatile. Capable of navigating both the open ocean and shallow rivers, these vessels could slip through the waves like a knife through butter, and then glide up a river to raid a monastery or trade with distant peoples. It was this dual ability that made the Longship the Swiss Army knife of its day, a tool for exploration, conflict, and commerce. As the sun climbs higher, the shipyard buzzes with activity. You assist in shaping the hull, your hands moving rhythmically with the adze, a tool that's as ancient as the craft itself. Every scrape and cut brings the ship closer to completion, each step a testament to human ingenuity and the Viking spirit of discovery. The air is filled with the smell of fresh-cut wood and the salty tang of the sea breeze, a promise of the adventures that lie just beyond the fjord. And let's not forget the sails, those great, billowing squares of linen or wool, dyed in vibrant reds and blues. They were as much about intimidation as they were about catching the wind. Imagine spotting that on the horizon, moving swiftly toward you, the sun glinting off the shields lining the ship's sides. It'd be enough to make any coastal villager reconsider their life choices. But before you set sail, a word on the economy of this endeavor. The Longship was not just a means of transport, it was an economic engine. Trade routes opened by these vessels brought goods from the farthest reaches of the known world. Amber from the Baltic, silks from Byzantium, silver from the Abbasid Caliphate. Viking longships were the cargo planes of their time, minus the peanuts and seatbelt instructions. As midday approaches, you pause to wipe your brow and steal a moment to reflect on the enormity of what's being built. This ship is more than timber and tar. It's a vessel of opportunity. It's a chance to venture beyond the known world, to carve out a destiny on foreign shores, and perhaps, just perhaps, to bring back tales and treasures that will echo through the ages. So, as you stand in the shipyard, surrounded by the hum of industry and the promise of adventure, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and ambition that underscore every plank and nail. This is more than a ship. It's a testament to the Viking spirit, a spirit that refuses to be bound by horizons or hemmed in by the ordinary. And as the sun dips toward the west, casting long shadows over the bustling village, you know that tomorrow the sea will beckon with the allure of the unknown, and you'll be ready to answer its call. As the sun dips below the horizon, its glow fades into the inky blackness of the sea, a sea that will soon become your highway and your battleground. Tomorrow, the adventure really begins. You've worked hard to craft a vessel worth the saga songs, but it's time to test your mettle against the North Sea's merciless waves. If you've ever thought Vikings were just a bunch of fearless, axe-wielding adventurers with nothing but brawn and bravado, think again. These folks were more like the Elon Musks of their day, visionaries armed with innovation and a dash of Viking bravado. Let's steer straight into the myth of the fearless Viking explorer. Yes, they were bold, but fearlessness. That's a marketing spin that even Apple would envy. Sailing in the age of Vikings wasn't a leisurely cruise with cocktail service. It was more like a high-stakes roller coaster with an iffy safety record. First off, navigation wasn't a walk in the park. Forget GPS or even a trusty map. These navigators had a toolkit that was more MacGyver than Magellan. Enter the Sunstone. Sounds mythical, right? Picture this. A crystal that could help you locate the sun even when it's hiding behind a wall of clouds. Scientists suggest Vikings used Iceland's spar, a type of calcite crystal which can polarize light and reveal the sun's position. It's not exactly satellite navigation, but for its time, it was cutting-edge stuff. And while it might sound like a plot device from a fantasy novel, archaeological evidence backs up its use. Because let's face it, you're not about to risk your life on the high seas without a decent plan. Now, let's talk about the early compass, or as the Vikings knew it, the sun compass. It was essentially a wooden disc with a pin in the middle, casting a shadow to indicate cardinal directions based on the sun's position. Ingenious? Absolutely. Flawless? Not quite. On a cloudy day, or during those long, dark Nordic winters, it was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. But hey, it was a start. As we set sail, consider the realities, the weather. The North Atlantic isn't known for its hospitality. Storms could whip up faster than a bard's verse, turning your longship into a glorified bath toy. These storms weren't just inconvenient, they were deadly. A Viking shipwreck wasn't just a soggy inconvenience. It was a real risk that could turn your dream of discovery into a salty nightmare. But here's the kicker. The Vikings knew it. They understood the sea's fury and planned accordingly, bringing along skilled navigators who could read the stars and clouds like their personal tabloids. They also packed extra supplies, dried fish, barley, maybe some ale if they were lucky. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep you alive when the going got tough. And trust me, it got tough. Now, before you get swept away by the romance of the open sea, let's talk logistics. A standard Viking longship, like the 24-meter Garkstead ship, carried about 32 oarsmen. But it wasn't just about brute force. These ships were marvels of efficiency, designed to be light enough for portaging over land, yet sturdy enough to brave the high seas. The crew had to be as versatile as the vessel, ready to row, sail, and even carry the ship if the journey demanded it. But no matter how well prepared, the Vikings couldn't escape the ocean's harsh realities. Food could run out faster than you can say fjord, and rationing was a grim necessity. A diet of dried fish and hard bread might sound quaint, but after weeks at sea, it was about as appealing as chewing on your own boot. Yet, rough seas and meager rations were just part of the gig, a small price to pay for the promise of glory and riches. And let's not ignore the constant threat of shipwrecks. Archaeological finds, like the wreck of the Scandalous ships in Roskilde Fjord, remind us that even the most skilled sailors could fall prey to the sea's treachery. These finds offer a sobering glimpse into the harsh reality of Viking exploration. The risk was as real as the reward. Yet, despite these challenges, the Vikings set sail, driven by a spirit of adventure and the promise of untold wealth. Their voyages opened trade routes and forged connections across continents. They brought back goods and tales from far-off lands, amber from the Baltics, spices from the East, and silver from the Islamic world. These were the spoils of a seafaring life, the rewards for braving the elements and defying the odds. So, as you stand at the prow of your longship, the salty wind in your hair and the horizon stretching before you, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and courage that defined the Viking Age. These were not just warriors and raiders. They were explorers and visionaries, navigating a world as unpredictable as the sea itself. And as you sail into the unknown, remember that history is written by those who dared to venture beyond the horizon and lived to tell the tale. As you sail into the unknown, it's time to take a closer look at the social dynamics aboard your Viking longship. This isn't a floating democracy where everyone gets a say. It's more like a medieval corporate ladder, with the chieftain perched comfortably at the top. Picture him as a CEO with a penchant for axes, steering the ship with a mix of charisma and authority. His word is law, and his decisions could mean the difference between a successful raid and becoming fish food. Below the chieftain, you've got the hersier, or the lieutenants if you will. These guys are like middle management, keeping the rowers in line and making sure the sails are set just right. They might not have the chieftain's swagger, but they wield enough power to make your life on board either tolerable or miserable. The crew itself, well, they're the backbone of this operation, the ones who actually get the ship from point A to point B. With about 32 rowers on a typical longship, these men are the ancient equivalent of your office cubicle dwellers, except their break room is the open sea and their refreshment is the bitter wind. They row in shifts, muscles burning as they propel the ship through the water, each oar stroke a testament to their endurance and collective spirit. Now, let's talk about living conditions, which were, to put it mildly, a bit cramped. Imagine bunking with 30 of your closest colleagues in a space smaller than your average city bus. Privacy. Forget it, personal space. Not in this lifetime. You're eating, sleeping, and working shoulder to shoulder, your only luxury being the salty breeze and the occasional splash of seawater. The ship's center is where the action happens. Meals are cooked in a small pit, a fire hazard that would make any modern safety inspector's hair stand on end. Food is basic. Think dried fish, hard bread, maybe some pickled herring if you're lucky. It's not exactly a 5-star dining experience, but it keeps you fueled for the relentless rowing and the occasional skirmish. But why endure these hardships? What's the carrot at the end of this stick? Simple, economic incentives. The lure of silver, spices, and slaves was enough to make even the most cautious Viking a risk-taker. Silver, in particular, was the ultimate status symbol, a currency that spoke louder than words. Imagine returning home, pockets jingling with silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, enough to buy a new farm or secure your family's future. And then there's the trade. Forget the image of Vikings as mere plunderers. These folks were savvy businessmen, setting up complex trading networks that spanned continents. They swapped amber from the Baltic for silks from Byzantium, creating a tapestry of commerce that defies the noble savage stereotype. These were not just marauders. They were merchants with a keen eye for profit. Yet, amidst all this economic ambition, is a dark side too, slavery. It's a grim reminder that the Viking Age wasn't all heroic sagas and epic voyages. Slaves, or thralls, were a commodity, captured during raids and traded like goods. A stark contrast to the romanticized image of the Viking warrior, yet an undeniable part of the historical record. As the day wears on, the sun reaches its zenith, casting a harsh light on the realities of life at sea. The adventure, the promise of riches, it's all there, but so are the hardships and moral complexities. This isn't just about glory and gold. It's about survival, ambition, and the relentless push beyond the horizon. The rhythm of the oars becomes a kind of music, a steady beat that underscores the journey. The crew works in harmony, each man a vital cog in the ship's machinery. It's a community, a floating microcosm of the larger Viking world, with all its hierarchies and dynamics. But before we get too misty-eyed about Viking camaraderie, let's bust another myth. The noble savage image is tempting, but it's a simplification. These were people driven by necessity and opportunity, as complex and flawed as any other. The truth is, Vikings weren't just raiders or traders. They were a bit of both, navigating a world that was as unpredictable and fierce as the sea they sailed. And as the sun begins its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, you realize that this journey is just as much about the people as it is about the destination. Each man aboard has his own reason for being here, his own story to tell. Some seek adventure, others riches, and a few, perhaps, redemption. There's an undeniable romance to the Viking Age, but it's a romance tempered by reality. These were people who lived on the edge, driven by a spirit of exploration and a thirst for what lay beyond the known world. They were adventurers, yes, but also pragmatists, with one foot in the saga and the other in the cold, hard facts of life. As evening approaches, the ship continues its steady course, a silhouette against the darkening sky. The sea shimmers under the moonlight, a reminder of the vastness that lies ahead. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities, but for now, you take a moment to reflect on the journey so far. The Viking Age was many things, an era of conquest, trade, and transformation. It was a time of great change, a period that reshaped the map and left a legacy that echoes through history. It was an age of exploration, not just of lands, but of ideas and possibilities. And as the ship sails onward, you can't help but wonder what lies beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to seek it. So, as the waves lap gently against the hull and the stars begin to twinkle in the sky, remember that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people with all their dreams, ambitions, and flaws. It's about the human spirit, always striving for more, ever curious, ever daring. And in that spirit, the Vikings were true pioneers, navigating not just the seas, but the very fabric of what it means to be human. As the stars sparkle above, and the sea whispers its timeless lullaby, let's delve into the complex diplomatic dance of the Vikings. These seafaring Norsemen weren't just about swinging axes and drinking mead till they passed out on bare skins. Nope, they were savvy operators who played the geopolitical chessboard of Europe like grandmasters. Forget the simplistic image of barbaric raiders. These folks were both feared and respected, often in the same breath. First, let's talk trade. The Vikings were like the Amazon Prime of the medieval world, minus the 2-day shipping guarantee. They set up shop from the icy reaches of Greenland to the bustling bazaars of Baghdad. The Dnieper and Volga rivers became their highways into the heart of Eastern Europe, leading to lucrative trade partnerships with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. They didn't just exchange goods, they swapped stories and ideas, like medieval TED talks on a longship. Now, let's not gloss over the darker side of these interactions. While trade was the Vikings' bread and butter, raids were the spicy side dish. The infamous Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD wasn't just an isolated event. It set the tone for centuries of coastal Europe shaking in its boots. But here's the kicker. These raids weren't just about plunder. They were tactical moves on the grand chessboard of power. By striking fear into the hearts of their neighbors, the Vikings ensured their reputation preceded them, opening doors to negotiation, or closing them depending on their mood. Consider the political implications. In England, for example, Viking influence was profound. The Danelaw, a region of northern and eastern England, came under Viking control, effectively making it a Norse colony. Here, the Vikings didn't just raid. They settled, intermarried, and introduced their own legal systems. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle may paint them as ruthless invaders, but they were also pragmatic settlers who knew that sometimes it was better to plant roots than to plunder and run. In Ireland, the story was a bit different. Dublin, founded by the Vikings in 841 AD, became a thriving trade hub. It was the Norse version of Wall Street, where silver flowed like ale at a Viking feast. The Vikings minted their own coins, leaving a lasting impact on the local economy. But don't get too misty-eyed. They still engaged in the occasional raid when business was slow. Old habits die hard after all. Now, let's take a detour to the east. The Rus, a group that included Swedish Vikings, established the first major Russian state, centered in Kiev. This wasn't just a military takeover, it was a cultural exchange. They brought with them their social structures, maritime technology, and a penchant for trade. The Arab historian Ibn Fadlan described them as perfect physical specimens, which is a nice way to say, these guys could bench press a bear. Politically, their presence in Eastern Europe was a game-changer. They served as mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire, even forming the emperor's elite Varangian guard. Talk about a change of scenery, from raiding monasteries to guarding emperors in the opulence of Constantinople. It was a world tour of epic proportions, with a side of political intrigue. But what about the cultural impact? Vikings left their mark not just with swords and silver, but with language and lore. Old Norse words seeped into the English language like rain into soil. Days of the week like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday owe their names to Norse gods. And if you've ever felt the urge to go berserk, you can thank the Vikings for that particular expression of rage. In Normandy, their influence was so profound that by 911 AD, the Viking leader Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king Charles the Simple. Rollo, in turn, swore fealty to the king, setting up a lineage that would eventually lead to William the Conqueror. So yes, when the Normans invaded England in 1066, it was essentially a Viking-on-Viking affair, a family reunion with swords. But let's not get carried away with the romance of it all. While the Norsemen were undoubtedly skilled diplomats and traders, they were also opportunists with a penchant for brutality. Slavery was woven into the fabric of their society. The thralls, captured in raids, were a grim reminder that Viking society, like many others, was built on the backs of those less fortunate. Yet, despite the brutality, there was a strange sense of respect for the Vikings across Europe, who were seen as both a threat and a force to be reckoned with, proof that reputation can be as powerful as any sword. Their adaptability and resilience allowed them to integrate into various cultures while still maintaining their identity. They were the ultimate cultural chameleons, blending in just enough to survive and thrive. As evening deepens, the horizon calls with the promise of new encounters and adventures. The Vikings, with their complex blend of warrior spirit and merchant savvy, remind us that history isn't black and white. It's a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads, each one telling its own story. And as we sail through these historical waters, it's clear that the Vikings were more than just marauders. They were a force of nature, shaping the world in ways still felt today. So, as the waves lap against the ship and the moon casts its silvery glow, remember that behind every legend is a gritty reality. The Vikings navigated not just the seas, but the shifting tides of politics and culture. They were both conquerors and settlers, traders and raiders, leaving a legacy as vast and varied as the oceans they sailed. And as the sea stretches out before you, know that tomorrow holds new stories, waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to seek them. As the moonlight dances on the waves, and the Longship cuts through the water like a knife through butter, it's time to head back to the Viking village with tales of triumph and treasure. You're not just bringing back goods, you're delivering stories that will echo around the hearth fires for generations. The journey has been long, but the rewards are tangible. A chest full of silver, perhaps a few exotic trinkets, and the satisfaction of having braved the elements. Returning to the village is like a hero's welcome, minus the red carpet. Instead, you're greeted by the familiar hustle and bustle of daily life, the scent of roasting meat mingling with the sharp tang of the sea. The villagers gather, eager to hear about your exploits. For them, you are the living embodiment of the Viking spirit, a mix of daring and practicality, a 9th century entrepreneur with an eye for opportunity. Ah, the Viking legacy. It's as intricate as a Norse knot, and twice as hard to untangle. Their maritime prowess was legendary, but it wasn't just about the ships themselves. It was about what those ships represented. They were the physical manifestation of a society that valued exploration and innovation, a people who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a bridge to new worlds. These longships were the Teslas of their time, sleek, efficient, and way ahead of the competition. They weren't just tools of war, they were instruments of change, setting the stage for the globalized world we know today. Now, let's tackle the myth of the Viking end. Spoiler alert, they didn't just vanish into the mists of history like some tragic rock band breakup. Instead, they integrated into European kingdoms, becoming part of the societal fabric. Take England, for example. The Norse influence didn't evaporate with the end of the Viking Age. It morphed, leaving behind a linguistic legacy that still echoes in words like sky, window, and egg. Not to mention, those Norse legal concepts laid the groundwork for systems still in place today. In Normandy, the story took a twist worthy of a Netflix drama. The region was handed over to the Vikings in 911 AD, and they didn't just settle, they thrived. Over time, they became the Normans, who would eventually launch their own epic conquest of England in 1066. It's a classic tale of adaptation and survival, showing how the Norsemen could pivot from raiders to rulers. Modern fascination with Viking heritage is a testament to the enduring appeal of these seafaring adventurers. It's not just about the horned helmets, those are pure fiction, by the way, but about the spirit of exploration and resilience. Shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom captivate audiences with tales of Norse bravery and cunning. But remember, these portrayals are more Hollywood than history, serving up drama with a side of artistic license. And let's not forget the genetic legacy. Advances in DNA technology have shed light on the Viking diaspora, revealing that their genetic fingerprints are scattered across Europe like breadcrumbs. It's a reminder that history isn't just something you read about, it's something you carry in your very cells. You might even have a dash of Viking blood yourself, a testament to their far-reaching influence. The Viking Age wasn't just a period of history, it was a crucible of change, a time when the world was both smaller and larger than ever before. The Vikings were actors on a global stage, their actions influencing trade, politics, and culture. They were a paradox, both feared and admired, brutal yet innovative. They remind us that history is messy, a tapestry woven with threads of both glory and gore. As you stand in the village, surrounded by the fruits of your labor and the eager faces of those who've stayed behind, it's clear that the Viking legacy is more than just tales of battle and conquest. It's a story of human endeavor, of people willing to push the boundaries of the known world. They were not just warriors or traders, they were pioneers, charting a course that would shape the future. So, as the night deepens and the stars twinkle like distant fires, take a moment to reflect on this incredible journey. The Vikings may have sailed into history, but their spirit of adventure and determination continues to inspire. They remind us that there's always another horizon to explore, another story to tell. And as you settle down by the fire, surrounded by kin and comrades, know that you are part of a tradition that stretches back centuries, a tradition of daring, of discovery, and of the relentless pursuit of what's beyond the next wave. When we think of European royalty, opulent palaces and lavish banquets might spring to mind, but behind those gilded walls lay a tangled web of intrigue, libido, and power plays that would make even the most dramatic soap opera blush. Kings and queens weren't just playing musical thrones. They were engaged in a high-stakes game of matrimonial chess, with their love lives often as strategic as a military campaign. And speaking of military campaigns, let's talk about Henry Roman VIII, the Tudor tornado who turned marital disaster into a national pastime. Henry, the man with 6 wives and a penchant for beheadings, wasn't just a monarch with a wandering eye. He was a king under pressure. You see, in the 16th century, producing a male heir was as crucial as securing the realm's borders. No son, no dynasty. Enter Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who bore him a daughter, Mary, but failed to produce the longed-for male heir. So, what does a king do when faced with dynastic doom? He rewrites the rules, of course, and thus the Church of England was born, all because the Pope wouldn't annul his marriage. Talk about a royal hissy fit with global repercussions. But Henry's matrimonial merry-go-round wasn't just about personal whims. Each of his marriages was a calculated move on the geopolitical chessboard. For instance, his union with Anne Boleyn, which ended with her infamous execution, was not just a romantic pursuit, it was a bold political gamble. Anne, a lady-in-waiting with a razor-sharp mind, captivated Henry, but the stakes were high. Their marriage aimed at cementing alliances and bolstering the Tudor claim, yet it crumbled under the weight of courtly conspiracies and Anne's failure to bear a son. Her downfall reminds us that in the ruthless world of royal courtships, Love was a luxury few could afford. Now, let's shatter the stained glass image of royal fidelity. The medieval and Renaissance courts were less about monogamous devotion and more about strategic dalliances. Affairs were practically a line item in the royal budget, with mistresses wielding significant influence. Take Louis Roman XIV of France, the Sun King, who didn't just spread his influence across Europe, but also his progeny. Over a dozen illegitimate children, all part of the royal tapestry. In this world, marriage was a contract, a merger of houses and lands, while love was often relegated to the shadows. The economic stakes behind these alliances were colossal. Marriages weren't just personal unions, they were economic treaties, with dowries and jointure agreements that could make or break a kingdom's fortunes. Catherine of Aragon brought a hefty dowry from Spain, which bolstered England's coffers. This wasn't just a match made in heaven, it was a financial transaction of epic proportions. And when things went south, as they often did, the economic repercussions were seismic. Henry's break from Rome wasn't just a theological split. It was a financial windfall as he seized monastic lands and riches to fill his war chest. But why all this fuss over royal bedroom antics? Because these intimate alliances shaped the course of history. A queen's fertility, or lack thereof, could lead to wars, religious upheaval, and the rise or fall of nations. So, while it's tempting to view these tales as mere scandalous titillation, they were in fact the heartbeat of European political strategy. As we peel back the layers of romantic myths, one thing becomes clear. In the Game of Thrones, love was never blind. It had 20/20 vision, focused squarely on power and legacy. And while these tales of royal debauchery and intrigue might seem like fodder for the tabloids, they were the very fabric of history, woven with threads of ambition, desire, and a touch of madness. So, as you drift off into a gentle slumber, ponder the paradox of power, that in the corridors of history, the most personal of choices had the most profound of consequences. Now, let's switch gears and waltz into the glittering halls of Versailles, where Louis Roman XIV, the Sun King, orchestrated a court that was equal parts theatrical spectacle and political battlefield. You see, for Louis, ruling France wasn't just about decrees and treaties. It was an art form, a grand performance in which every detail, from the cut of his coat to the choice of his mistresses, was a calculated move on the chessboard of power. Louis Roman XIV reign was as much about keeping up appearances as it was about governance. The Palace of Versailles, with its 300 rooms and 17,000 acres of gardens, was more than just a royal residence. It was a stage where power plays unfolded with the grace of a ballet. The Sun King knew that to keep his court under control, he had to keep them close and entertained. So he turned Versailles into a gilded cage, where nobles clamored for his favor, and their every move was as scrutinized as the latest fashion trend. But let's not kid ourselves. Behind the opulent facade lay a world where sexual liaisons were as common as powdered wigs. In fact, Louis's mistresses were more than just romantic diversions. They were key players in the king's political strategy. Enter Madame de Montespan, the most famous of Louis's many paramours. Known for her sharp wit and even sharper ambition, she was the queen of courtly intrigue. Madame de Montespan, born Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, came from a noble but not overly influential family. Her ascent to power was a masterclass in courtly maneuvering, and by 1667 she had captured the king's heart, and more importantly, his ear. For over a decade, she wielded immense influence, using her position to sway political decisions and secure lucrative positions for her allies. At the height of her power, she was said to be the real power behind the throne, fact that didn't go unnoticed by the courtiers who vied for her favor. Yet, the path of a royal mistress was fraught with peril. The French court was a hotbed of jealousy and intrigue, where alliances shifted as quickly as the fashions. Montespan's fall from grace was as dramatic as her rise. Accusations of witchcraft and involvement in the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal involving black magic and attempted murder, led to her disgrace. Although she was never formally charged, the mere whiff of scandal was enough to send her to the sidelines. In the cutthroat world of Versailles, her story is a cautionary tale of how quickly favor could be lost. The stakes of favoritism in Louis's court weren't just personal, they were profoundly economic. The cost of maintaining favor with the king was exorbitant. Noble families spent fortunes on lavish gifts, grand balls, and extravagant clothing to outshine their rivals. The economic ripple effect was enormous, as fortunes were made and lost on the whims of royal favor. Versailles itself was a testament to this excess, a palace that cost an estimated 116 million livres, a sum that strained even the royal coffers. Yet, the Sun King's court was more than just a den of decadence. It was a microcosm of the political and social dynamics that shaped France. Louis's ability to centralize power and control the nobility was as much about psychology as it was about military might. By drawing the nobility to Versailles, he effectively neutered their power bases and kept them too busy with courtly intrigues to mount any significant opposition. It was a masterstroke of political strategy, wrapped in the trappings of courtly glamour. But while Louis's court was a marvel of organization and control, it was also a reminder of the fragility of power built on personal relationships. The king's reliance on his mistresses and favorites left him vulnerable to their ambitions and betrayals. The affair of the poisons, which implicated several courtiers in plots of murder and sorcery, was a stark demonstration of how the personal and political were inextricably intertwined at Versailles. As we peek behind the velvet curtains of Louis's court, it becomes clear that the romanticized image of the Sun King and his court obscures a much darker reality. The glittering facade of Versailles masked a world where power was as ephemeral as the fashions, and where the price of ambition could be ruinous. In this world, the personal was political, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. So, while it's tempting to get swept up in the tales of courtly love and intrigue, it's important to remember that these stories were more than just romantic escapades. They were the very mechanisms of power in an age where the personal was always political, and where the games of the heart were often the most dangerous of all. As we continue our journey through the annals of royal scandal, keep in mind that behind every story of love and betrayal lies a deeper story of power, ambition, and the human condition. As we leave the glittering yet duplicitous halls of Versailles behind, let's take a brisk ride eastward to the vast, snow-draped expanses of Russia, where the tales get even wilder. Enter Catherine the Great, the empress whose name is forever linked with one of the most outrageous and frankly bizarre rumors in royal history. No, she didn't die in some equine misadventure, despite what the salacious whisperings of the time might suggest. That particular legend is about as factual as a unicorn sighting, but it sure makes for a tantalizing headline, doesn't it? Let's set the record straight. Catherine the Great didn't perish beneath a horse. The rumor, likely cooked up by her many enemies who had more free time than scruples, was a classic case of historical mudslinging. It's a testament to the power of gossip, then as now, that such an absurd story gained traction. But why did this particular myth stick like a burr on the hem of history? Because in the realm of royal rumor, the more sensational the story, the more people wanted to believe it. It's the historical equivalent of a juicy tabloid headline, irresistible in its audacity. Now, Catherine's real romantic entanglements were less about barnyard antics and more about political maneuvering. She was a woman who knew how to mix business with pleasure. In the dog-eat-dog world of 18th century Russia, her relationships were as strategic as they were personal. Sure, she had a string of lovers, 12 official ones if you're keeping count, but each was chosen with the precision of a military campaign. These weren't just flings, they were alliances, each one bringing something valuable to the imperial table, whether it was political support, military prowess, or a fresh perspective on governance. Take Grigory Potemkin, for instance, one of her most famous paramours. Potemkin wasn't just a pretty face. He was a statesman and military strategist par excellence. Together, they cooked up schemes that would make Machiavelli proud, expanding the Russian Empire at a clip that would leave most monarchs breathless. Their partnership was a tour de force that reshaped the geopolitical landscape, with Potemkin orchestrating the annexation of Crimea in 1783, a move that not only expanded Russia's reach, but also secured vital access to the Black Sea. Catherine's love life was a political chessboard, and she played it with the dexterity of a grandmaster. Yet, despite her prowess, the rumors were relentless. Why? Because in the cutthroat arena of royal politics, character assassination was a go-to tactic. Stories about Catherine's supposed sexual escapades were weapons, crafted by her enemies to undermine her authority and cast doubt on her capability to rule. The myth of her death by horse was just the crescendo in a symphony of slander. As the saying goes, if you can't kill the queen, kill her reputation. In the broader context, this smear campaign was par for the course in the high-stakes world of European royalty. Back then, well-timed rumor could be as devastating as an invading army. Royal courts were less about gallant knights and fair maidens, and more about whispers in the corridors and daggers in the dark. The weaponization of rumor was a craft honed to a fine edge, and Catherine's contemporaries wielded it with relish. But let's not paint Catherine solely as the victim of malicious gossip. She was a force of nature, a ruler who didn't just survive in a male-dominated world, but thrived. Her reign, from 1762 to 1796, was marked by a cultural renaissance in Russia, with Catherine spearheading reforms in education and the arts. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, showcasing her Enlightenment ideals, and her court became a hub of intellectual discourse. Under her leadership, Russia became a cultural powerhouse, a transformation as dramatic as her personal escapades were exaggerated. Yet, for all her achievements, the myths persist, a reminder of how history loves its juicy tidbits, regardless of their veracity. The legend of Catherine and her equine demise is a case study in how narratives can overshadow reality. It's a cautionary tale about the seductive power of scandal and the human penchant for believing the unbelievable. After all, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? In examining Catherine's legacy, it's important to separate the woman from the myth. She was a monarch who defied convention, steering Russia through a period of significant change. Her personal life, while colorful, was just one facet of a complex, dynamic ruler. The real story isn't about horses. It's about a woman who wielded power with intelligence and aplomb, reshaping a nation in the process. As we roll this narrative forward, the blend of fact and fiction in Catherine's story serves as a microcosm of the age. It illustrates how history is not just written by the victors, but also by the storytellers, those who spin tales as potent as any decree or edict. Catherine's legacy, both illustrious and infamous, is a testament to the enduring power of narrative. It's a reminder that in the annals of history, the line between reality and myth is often as thin as an emperor's new clothes. So as we continue our journey through the salacious and strategic world of Europe's royal houses, let's keep an eye out for those blurred lines and whispered tales. Because in the end, it's not just the battles and treaties that shape history, but the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we choose to believe. As much as we love a juicy piece of royal gossip, it's time to pivot to the Habsburgs, a family whose matrimonial strategies would make a soap opera look like a Sesame Street episode. Welcome to a world where marrying your cousin wasn't just a risky gamble, it was practically a family tradition. You see, the Habsburgs took the phrase, keeping it in the family, to dizzying new heights. In their quest to consolidate power across Europe, they created a genetic cocktail that would eventually explode in their faces, quite literally. In the case of Charles Roman II of Spain, why did the Habsburgs play the genetic lottery with such reckless abandon? Well, it all boils down to power and territory. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was a patchwork quilt of principalities, duchies, and kingdoms. Marriage was the needle that stitched these patches together, creating alliances that could make or break a dynasty. The Habsburgs, with their insatiable appetite for dominance, viewed marital unions as a means to an end, the end being the control of as much land as possible. And boy, were they successful. At their zenith, the sun never set on the Habsburg Empire, controlling swaths of land from Spain to Austria and beyond. But here's where things get tricky. The Habsburgs, in their quest to amass power, became the poster children for the pitfalls of consanguinity. By continually marrying within their own bloodline, they created a genetic bottleneck that would have given Darwin nightmares. Enter Charles Roman II of Spain, the unfortunate poster boy for the dynastic consequences of this inbreeding bonanza. Charles Roman II, born in 1661, was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and his life was a tragic testament to the genetic roulette his ancestors had played. Known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, Charles's health was a laundry list of ailments that modern science can attribute to inbreeding. He was epileptic, physically deformed, and suffered from severe mental disabilities. The Habsburg jaw, that infamous protruding chin, was just the outward sign of a dynasty that had ignored the basic rules of genetics for too long. His birth was a political catastrophe dressed up as a royal event. Charles's inability to produce an heir wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic crisis that threatened the very foundations of Habsburg power. The economic implications were enormous. Spain, already reeling from costly wars and a declining economy, couldn't afford a power vacuum. The spectre of a succession crisis loomed large, as European powers circled like vultures, eager to snap up pieces of the empire. Now, you might wonder why no one in the Habsburg court thought to diversify the gene pool with a little outside influence. The answer lies in the tangled web of politics and tradition. Marrying outside the family could mean the loss of territory or influence, an unthinkable prospect for a family that had built its empire on strategic alliances. But let's not romanticize this as some noble sacrifice for the greater good. The Habsburgs were as much prisoners of their own making as they were architects of their fate. The personal freedoms sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition were staggering. Royals were pawns in a game played by elders, their lives charted out from birth with little regard for personal happiness. A Habsburg princess might dream of love, but she'd wake up married to a cousin twice removed, all in the name of political expediency. Charles Roman II reign, from 1665 until his death in 1700, was a long, slow decline into chaos. His inability to produce an heir left Spain vulnerable to external threats and internal strife. The War of Spanish Succession, which erupted shortly after his death, was the inevitable fallout from a century of genetic gambling. It was a brutal reminder that in the Game of Thrones, biology doesn't care much for royal bloodlines. The economic ramifications of these genetic choices were profound. The Habsburgs' reliance on inbreeding created a cycle of instability that drained the Cathars and left Spain a shadow of its former self. As the empire crumbled, the cost of maintaining power became astronomical. Wars, both external and internal, siphoned off resources at an alarming rate. The once mighty Habsburgs found themselves scrambling to patch up an empire that was unraveling at the seams. In the grand tapestry of history, the Habsburg story is a cautionary tale about the perils of prioritizing power over pragmatism. It's the ultimate irony that a family so obsessed with control would be undone by the very policies they championed. The genetic legacy of their choices is a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you create yourself. As we leave Charles Roman II and his ill-fated reign behind, it's clear that the Habsburg story is far from over. Their empire may have crumbled, but their legacy lives on, a testament to the complexities of power, ambition, and the human condition. So, as we continue our journey through the annals of royal history, remember that behind every throne lies a tangled web of choices, both personal and political. And in the end, it's these choices that shape the course of history, for better or for worse. While the Habsburgs' tale winds down, it's clear that what happened in those royal chambers didn't stay there. The echoes of their dynastic drama, much like those of their contemporaries, ripple through history, informing our modern fascination with celebrity culture. Swap royal robes for red carpets, and you'll find striking parallels. Just as nobles once jockeyed for power and prestige in the shadowy corridors of court, today's celebrities navigate the equally treacherous world of fame, where a single misstep can trigger a media storm. Consider the tabloids as the modern equivalent of court gossip. Every paparazzi snapshot a painted portrait, each scandalous headline a whispered rumor. The Kardashians, for instance, have built an empire on the very currency that sustained royal courts: visibility. Much like Louis Roman XIV, who turned Versailles into a theater of power, today's celebrities craft their lives into a spectacle. The Sun King would have found Instagram the perfect platform for his grand performances, each post a carefully curated scene to maintain his golden glow. And speaking of curated images, let's not forget the royal penchant for myth-making. Just as Catherine the Great battled against those equine rumors, celebrities today face a relentless churn of fabrications. The myth of the unattainable but scandal-ridden idol persists, fueled by an audience hungry for both aspiration and the thrill of downfall. It's a dynamic as old as time. Build them up, watch them fall, then repeat. It's the cyclical nature of fame, as predictable as the changing of the seasons. Yet, there's more than just superficial glamour at stake. The narratives spun around these figures, both then and now, shape our understanding of power and sexuality. Once upon a time, a king's mistress could sway political decisions, much like today's influencers who can topple trends with a single tweet. But while the faces and mediums have changed, the game remains the same. Influence is the ultimate currency, and everyone's vying for the top spot. The royal bedroom antics we've explored are not just historical footnotes. They're enduring templates for how we perceive and engage with power. The idea that personal relationships can dictate political landscapes is a concept as relevant today as it was in the days of the Tudors or the Habsburgs. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's exit from the British royal family, dubbed Megxit, is a modern reminder that personal choices in the royal sphere can trigger global discussions, much like Henry Roman VIII, matrimonial maneuvers reshaped England. But here's the kicker. While the allure of royal scandal is irresistible, the true lessons lie in sifting myth from reality. It's easy to get swept up by the romance of a power couple or the intrigue of a clandestine affair, but the real impact of these stories is felt in their economic and political aftermath. Catherine the Great's policies, not her rumored escapades, expanded Russia's reach. Louis Roman XIV's centralization of power, not his mistresses, defined his reign. Even Charles Roman II's tragic life teaches a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing dynasty over diversity. In the grand tapestry of history, these stories remind us to look beyond the surface, to question what we think we know. History, after all, is less about what happened and more about who tells the story. The seductive myths that cling to these figures are often crafted by those with an agenda, whether it's to undermine a ruler or sell a newspaper. The trick is to enjoy the story while being wise to its embellishments. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour through the scandalous corridors of European royalty, it's clear that the past is never truly past. Its fingerprints are all over our modern world, shaping perceptions of power, sexuality, and influence. By examining the legends alongside the harsh realities, we gain not just a peek into the lives of rulers, but a mirror reflecting our own societal values and obsessions. So next time you hear a tale of royal intrigue or celebrity gossip, remember, behind every glittering facade lies a complex web of ambition, strategy, and human folly. The stories we tell about those in power, whether they wear crowns or designer gowns, are as much about us as they are about them. In the end, separating myth from reality isn't just an exercise in history. It's a vital skill for understanding the world we live in. As we drift off, content in our newfound knowledge, let's keep that in mind and dream of a history that's as much ours to shape as it is to learn from. You know, if you were a medieval stonemason, your life might feel less like a romantic history book and more like an endless episode of a reality survival show, without the luxury of a camera crew to save you. Picture yourself at the tender age of 12, when modern kids might be stressing out over math homework or leveling up in a video game. Instead, you're signing up for a career that involves more grit than glamour. Welcome to the world of medieval stone masonry, where your alarm clock is a bell tower, and your day starts at sunrise whether you like it or not. At 12, you begin your apprenticeship, which is basically a medieval version of a grueling internship with no coffee breaks. As an apprentice, you're at the bottom of the food chain, and it's all about learning the ropes from the ground up, literally. Your main task, mastering the art of shaping stone with tools that make a caveman's toolkit look high-tech. A mallet and chisel will become your new best friends, though they'd never make it to your Facebook friends list if such a thing existed. Your hands would soon resemble sandpaper, and if you're lucky, they'd still be attached at the end of a hard day's work. Now, let's talk about the apprenticeship system. This wasn't a quick summer gig. We're talking about a commitment that could last anywhere from 7 to 9 years. Yes, you heard right. Almost a decade of your life dedicated to perfecting the fine art of not smashing your thumb every time you swung a hammer. In exchange, you'd receive food, lodging, and the opportunity to become a master mason someday. It's the medieval version of pay now, play later, though the play part might just mean slightly easier work. Working hours. Forget the cushy 9 to 5. You rise with the sun and work until it sets, sometimes a good 12 to 14 hours a day, depending on the time of year. That's right. You're clocking in more hours than a modern-day startup founder. And if you think the weekend was a time for leisurely pursuits, think again. Sunday was your only day of rest, and even then, it was often filled with church services and the occasional nap. Not exactly a spa day. The bell tower, that iconic symbol of medieval towns, wasn't just for decoration. It was your daily timekeeper, dictating when to start chiseling and when to stop. It's like living with a giant, stone-structured Fitbit that doesn't care about your personal time. The bells would toll at regular intervals, and you best be sure you're on the right side of them, unless you fancied a stern talking to, or worse, a cut in wages. Speaking of wages, don't expect to be swimming in coins. Masonry might have been a prestigious trade, but it didn't mean you were rolling in gold, more like scraping by with just enough to keep you and your family fed. You'd think with all this hard work, the masons would at least have some artistic liberty. Sorry, but the architectural plans were usually set in stone, pun intended, by someone else. Your job was execution, not innovation. Sure, you might get the occasional chance to carve a gargoyle or two, but mainly you're stacking stones to someone else's blueprint. It's a bit like being an artist who spends most of their time painting by numbers. Yet, for all its hardships, there was something undeniably impressive about the life of a mason. You were part of a legacy, building cathedrals, castles, and fortifications that would stand for centuries. Each stone you laid was a part of history, even if it came at the expense of your own comfort and leisure. That bell might have been your taskmaster, but it was also a testament to the role you played in crafting the medieval skyline. In essence, being a medieval stone, mason was a paradox of prestige and toil. You were creating the wonders of the world, one back-breaking block at a time. So next time you admire a medieval cathedral or a castle on a hill, spare a thought for the 12-year-old apprentice who spent his youth eating dust and dreaming of the day he'd finally become a master. And if you think the prestige of masonry came with a hefty paycheck, hold onto your chisel, because reality's about to hit like a stray hammer. The going rate for a day's labor was about 4 pence. Sure, it sounds quaintly simple, like a neat little package of medieval economics, but let's break it down. 4 pence might have been enough to keep you from starvation, but it wasn't exactly guaranteeing you a life of luxury. In modern terms, think of it as minimum wage with none of the perks, benefits, or sick days. More like a survival wage, really. Now, before you start fantasizing about buying a medieval mansion with your hard-earned coin, let's talk expenses. That 4 pence had to stretch further than a piece of well-chewed gum. By the time you paid for food, rent, and maybe a new pair of shoes every few years, your purse was lighter than a feather. Bread, staple of your diet, and the backbone of medieval meals, could cost up to a halfpenny a loaf. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days, and vegetables, while cheaper, weren't exactly abundant in the average mason's diet. The dream of owning your own tools, which was a rite of passage for any aspiring mason, was another financial hurdle. Tools were your livelihood, and losing one could mean borrowing or begging to replace it. Imagine if your laptop or smartphone vanished, and you had to cough up a hefty sum to get back to work. That's the medieval equivalent of a bad day at the office. But hey, maybe you could save up, right? Well, not so fast. Enter inflation, one of history's least entertaining recurring characters. Prices could inflate faster than a balloon at a kid's birthday party. And just like that, your precious 4 pence started feeling like 3 pence. Throw in taxes that made sure even the poorest of the poor contributed to the local lord's latest castle renovation. And your economic situation started resembling a losing game of medieval Monopoly. Just when you thought you were finally passing go, the local lord would slap you with a random fine for some obscure breach of his arbitrary rules. The phrase, "the house always wins," started to make a lot more sense. And then, in what sounds like the plot twist of a grim fairy tale, the mid-14th century brought the Black Death, a catastrophic pandemic that wiped out around a third of Europe's population. Suddenly, the shortage of labor meant that surviving masons could demand higher wages. Here's where things take a curious turn. Enter the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a piece of legislation that said, "Not so fast, buddy." This law was essentially the medieval equivalent of putting a cap on your salary, a legislative ceiling that forced wages back to pre-plague levels, regardless of demand. The statute was supposed to stabilize the economy, but for masons, it felt like being handed a shiny new hammer only to have it snatched away. The authorities want to preserve the pre-plague economic status quo, but the laborers had other ideas. Many simply ignored the statute, demanding and often receiving higher wages anyway, especially in places where the demand for stonework was high. It was a bold move, like flipping the bird to the establishment with a chisel in hand. Despite the oppressive economic conditions, the post-plague period saw a spark of rebellion and resilience among the working classes. The demand for buildings didn't diminish, and even the lords knew they couldn't construct that new manor or chapel without skilled hands. It was a delicate dance of power, need, and negotiation, with masons somehow managing to chisel out a slightly better deal for themselves. As a mason, you were constantly juggling these economic realities with the physical demands of the trade. Your hands might have been calloused, your back bent, but your mind had to stay sharp to navigate the financial tightrope of medieval life. It wasn't just about surviving another day. It was about carving out a future in stone, one penny at a time. So, while the legends of castles and cathedrals might still stand in awe-inspiring testament to human ambition, the reality was more about the quiet grind and hustle of everyday life. All this, of course, set the stage for the next act in our historical drama. The labor market was changing, society was evolving, and the masons, those unsung architects of history, were right in the thick of it. Stay tuned, because the medieval world still has a few more surprises up its stone-hewn sleeve. All right, so you've got your medieval mason, caught in the swirling winds of change, chiseling away at stone while trying to dodge the economic debris of the post-plague world. But let's not forget what it really meant to be knee-deep in the dust of this gritty trade. Imagine waking up to a day not just filled with financial juggling, but one where every step could quite literally be your last. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty, pun fully intended, of the daily grind. Picture this. You're perched precariously on a rickety scaffold, which, by modern standards, would make any safety inspector break out in hives. Forget about hard hats or harnesses. The best you could hope for was a prayer to St. Barbara, the patron saint of dangerous jobs. And trust me, masonry was about as dangerous as it got. The safety net was nothing more than the ground below, ready to remind you just how much gravity sucks when you make a misstep. Your trusty tools, well, they were more like medieval torture devices than anything you'd find in a modern toolbox. A mallet, chisel, and maybe a rudimentary saw if you were lucky. Forget power tools or hydraulic lifts. Your power source was pure muscle, and every stone felt like a personal vendetta against your back. The stones themselves were no pebbles. These were hefty chunks of limestone or granite, often weighing more than your average donkey, a fact not lost on the masons who had to hoist them skyward using nothing more than ropes and pulleys. It was a medieval cross-fit workout, with each block a ticket to a future of chronic back pain. Now, if you think building on-site was tough, spare a thought for the process of getting the stone there in the first place. Quarries could be located miles away from the construction site, turning the logistics of transportation into a medieval nightmare. Picture a convoy of oxen-drawn carts, each loaded with stone, trudging along rutted roads that would make modern potholes look like minor inconveniences. The journey could take days, depending on the distance and the weather. And let's not forget the inevitable delays caused by bandits, broken wheels, or the occasional ox deciding it's had enough of this whole being an ox business. Once on site, the real fun began. Without cranes or forklifts, it was all about manpower. Hoisting stones required a team effort, with workers using wooden scaffolds, ramps, and sheer willpower to lift each stone into place. The ingenuity was impressive, but it was also a recipe for disaster. One slip of a rope, one misjudged counterweight, and you could find yourself in a heap of rubble, literally and metaphorically. The hazards of the job weren't limited to the physical realm either. Remember, this was a world where superstition ran as thick as the mortar between the stones. Accidents were often attributed to bad omens or curses, leading to a constant undercurrent of tension among the workers. Imagine trying to focus on not dropping a boulder on your foot while worrying about whether you'd offended the local witch or if Mercury was in retrograde. Despite these challenges, the masons persevered, driven by a mix of necessity, pride, and the tantalizing promise of one day becoming a master mason. The cathedrals and castles they built weren't just structures. They were symbols of faith, power, and human endurance. Each stone was a testament to the collective sweat and sacrifice of those who dared to defy gravity and common sense in the name of architectural glory. But let's not romanticize it too much. For the average mason, the work was grueling, the pay meager, and the risks ever present. It was a life lived on the edge, quite literally when you consider the heights they worked at, with only a thin line between survival and disaster. Yet, in spite of, or perhaps because of, these hardships, masons carved their place in history, one stone at a time. So, when you next gaze up at a medieval cathedral, marvel at its soaring arches and intricate carvings, remember the masons who toiled to bring it into being. They were the unsung heroes, armed with nothing but their tools, their determination, and perhaps a little bit of madness. In a world that often seemed stacked against them, they left a legacy as enduring as the stones they shaped. And while their backs may have ached and their fingers bled, they knew they were part of something bigger, building not just structures, but the very fabric of medieval society itself. As we continue this journey into the world of medieval masonry, keep in mind that the story is far from over. There's still more to uncover about the social dynamics, the struggle for recognition, and the relentless march of progress that reshaped the landscape as much as the stones themselves. Stay tuned as we dig deeper into the lives of those who turned raw stone into enduring history. So, you've got these masons who are physically shaping the world around them, but socially stuck in a weird limbo. Let's face it, being a medieval stone mason meant you were basically the middle child of the socio-economic ladder, often overlooked, sometimes appreciated, but never quite getting the glory. Sure, you had skills that could transform rock into cathedrals, but that didn't exactly translate to a seat at the high table. In medieval Europe, society was as stratified as a well-layered trifle. At the top, you had the nobles and clergy, feasting on roast swan and sipping mead like it was going out of style. Below them were the guilds, those exclusive clubs that wielded power like a medieval boardroom. For trades like blacksmithing or weaving, guild membership was your ticket to the big leagues. They controlled trade regulations, set apprenticeship standards, and even negotiated wages with the kind of clout that would make a modern labor union blush. But stone masons, they were often left out of these elite guilds, floating in this nebulous space between the peasantry and the privileged. They had skills that were in demand, but not the political muscle to match. In some regions, the masons formed their own guilds, but these were often overshadowed by the more powerful associations. It was a bit like starting your own indie band in a world dominated by major record labels. Enter the Freemasons, the rogues of the masonry world. These were the guys who packed their tools, kissed their families goodbye, and hit the road in search of work. They were the itinerant workers of their time, wandering from one construction site to the next, leaving behind a trail of unfinished hearths and half-built walls. Because of their nomadic lifestyle, Freemasons developed a reputation for being secretive. They communicated using signs and passwords, partly to protect their trade secrets, and partly to ensure they could identify each other in a new town. After all, when your livelihood depends on who you know, a secret handshake can be as valuable as a master's chisel. This cloak and dagger approach to networking inevitably led to conspiracy theories that would make a modern thriller novelist proud. People started whispering about the Freemasons' hidden agendas and mysterious rituals. Were they plotting to overthrow the monarchy? Did they possess ancient knowledge passed down from the builders of Solomon's temple? The truth was probably far less exciting. They were more likely swapping tips on the best taverns and how to avoid dodgy scaffolding. But let's not forget the human cost of this itinerant lifestyle. Constantly on the move, Freemasons were often separated from their families for months, sometimes years at a time. Communication was limited to sporadic letters, and homecomings were bittersweet affairs, followed by another round of goodbyes. It was less home, sweet home, and more home until the next job comes along. Despite the romantic notion of a life on the road, the reality was grittier than a quarry floor. Travel was perilous, with bandits lurking in forests and the ever-present threat of disease. Inns were crowded, and the welcome mat was often as worn as the travelers themselves. You'd be lucky to find a bed without fleas, let alone one with sheets. The road was a great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a master mason or an apprentice, the hardships were the same. Yet, for all the hardships, there was an undeniable appeal to the Freemasons' way of life. The chance to see new places, work on grand projects, and meet people from different walks of life was a powerful draw. Plus, in a world where status was often inherited rather than earned, becoming a Freemason offered a rare opportunity for social mobility. The skills you honed on the road could elevate you from a humble craftsman to a respected master, provided you survived the journey. Despite the challenges, these itinerant masons were indispensable. They were the ones who kept the architectural heart of medieval Europe beating, moving from town to town, breathing life into stone with each project. They may have been outsiders in the guild system, but they were insiders in the most literal sense. Inside the walls they built, inside the cathedrals that touched the heavens, and inside the fortresses that defined borders. The Freemasons' legacy is still visible today, not just in the buildings they left behind, but in the myths and legends that have grown around them. They were the original road warriors, living lives that were as transient as they were impactful. In a world that often favored the settled and the stable, they carved out a niche for themselves, one stone at a time. And while their secrets may never be fully revealed, their contributions to history are as solid as the stones they shaped. Stay tuned, because the story of masonry in the medieval world is far from finished. There's more to explore about the social dynamics, the mystery of the Freemasons, and the enduring impact of these unsung heroes of history. So, keep your chisels sharp, and your curiosity sharper, as we continue to unearth the story of those who turned raw stone into the very foundation of civilization. Despite their elusive nature and the myths that swirled around them, medieval masons left an indelible mark on history's canvas, one stone at a time. These folks weren't just the artistic visionaries behind soaring cathedrals, but the unsung architects of Europe's very backbone. These skilled craftsmen were the real deal, shaping not just religious monuments, but also the everyday structures that defined medieval life, castles, bridges, and even those humble town walls that kept bandits and invaders at bay. So, let's dig into the true legacy of these stone-wielding warriors. First off, let's get real about the whole cathedral builder stereotype. Sure, cathedrals are the rock stars of medieval architecture, literally and figuratively. With their flying buttresses and stained glass windows, they look like something out of a fantasy novel. But masons weren't just about creating places for spiritual enlightenment. No, they were more like the all-terrain vehicles of the architectural world, versatile and ready to tackle any project. Castles, for instance, were their bread and butter. With over 10,000 medieval castles dotted across Europe, from France's Shadow to Chambord to Scotland's Stirling Castle, masons were practically the medieval version of a construction crew working overtime. And let's not forget bridges. Before the days of steel and suspension, getting from one side of a river to the other was a bit of a headache. Enter our trusty masons, who constructed stone bridges that could withstand the test of time and the occasional flood. Take the Pont Saint-Bénézet in Avignon, built in the late 12th century. This bridge was so well engineered that it became the stuff of legend, inspiring songs, dances, and you guessed it, more myths. But wait, there's more. Masons also played a crucial role in building the everyday essentials that we often take for granted. Town walls, aqueducts, and even the occasional manor house for a local bigwig. These structures weren't about glitz and glamour, but about functionality and survival. Without them, the medieval world would have been, well, a lot more medieval. Now, while we're debunking myths, let's talk about the iconic gargoyle. You know, those creepy stone creatures jutting out from cathedrals like something straight out of a horror flick. They weren't just there to give you nightmares. Gargoyles had a practical purpose. They acted as medieval rain gutters, channeling water away from the building's walls. Masons carved these beasts with a mix of whimsy and practicality, proving once again that their work was both artistic and utilitarian. Let's zoom out and put this into a broader context. In the medieval world, architecture was not just about aesthetics. It was about power, politics, and protection. Castles weren't just homes for the nobility. They were fortresses designed to withstand sieges and project dominance. Bridges weren't just crossings. They were lifelines enabling trade and communication. And town walls. Well, without them, any self-respecting medieval town would be just a sitting duck for marauders with a penchant for pillaging. But what about the masons themselves? These guys weren't just grunts with chisels. They were highly skilled artisans whose work required not only physical strength, but also mathematical precision. and artistic flair. Becoming a master mason was akin to earning a PhD in rock manipulation, minus the student loans. Masons had to understand geometry, physics, and design like the back of their calloused hands. They were the original multitaskers, combining engineering, artistry, and a bit of magic to create structures that would last for centuries. And last they did. Fast forward to modern times, and those medieval structures still stand as testament to their creators' genius, skill, and sheer stubbornness. Look at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris or the Tower of London, both iconic landmarks that owe their existence to the sweat and savvy of medieval masons. These buildings are time capsules, offering a glimpse into a world where craftsmanship and creativity went hand in hand. Yet, as we admire these architectural wonders, let's not forget the human stories behind them. The Masons were more than just names chiseled into history books. They were real people with real lives, navigating a world of economic uncertainty and physical danger. They were the backbone of medieval society, shaping the world in ways that went beyond bricks and mortar. So, next time you find yourself wandering through a medieval town or gazing up at a stone cathedral, spare a thought for the Masons who made it all possible. Their legacy is not just in the stones they laid, but in the enduring spirit of innovation and determination that they embodied. They were the unsung heroes of their time, crafting the foundations of a world that still captivates our imaginations today. In the end, the story of medieval Masons is a story of resilience, creativity, and transformation. They took raw, unyielding stone and turned it into something extraordinary, bridging the gap between the past and the present, leaving a legacy as solid and timeless as the structures they built. So, here's to the Masons, the original rock stars of history, whose work continues to inspire and awe, centuries after the last chisel struck stone.